Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's strangest tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through the most bizarre, shocking, and utterly true stories from British royal history. Tales so strange, they seem impossible, yet every word is documented fact, from kings who lost their minds and talked to trees, to corpses that exploded and were licked by dogs, from six-fingered queens who never existed, to monarchs with teeth as black as coal. These are the stories that history tried to hide, the peculiar truths behind the crown's glittering facade. Before you drift into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you. What's the most bizarre royal fact you've ever heard? Drop a comment below. Even just a single word or emoji works perfectly. And if you enjoy these soothing historical tales, a gentle like and subscribe helps us bring more curious stories to your bedtime routine. Don't worry, there's no pressure. We're just happy you're here, cozy and ready for sleep. So settle in, close your eyes, and let these whispers from history's most peculiar moments lull you into restful sleep. Welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. The Mad King who talked to trees, George, later known as King George III of Great Britain and Ireland, came into this world on June 4th, 1738, in Norfolk House, London. He arrived 2 months earlier than expected, a premature infant whose survival seemed uncertain to the physicians attending his birth. Nobody could have predicted that this fragile baby would grow to become Britain's longest reigning king up to that point, ruling for nearly 6 decades, nor that his name would become forever associated with both empire and madness. The young prince grew up in a world of strict routine and careful education. His grandfather, King George II, sat upon the throne, a German-born monarch who never quite mastered the English language. Young George's father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, despised his own father with an intensity that poisoned the royal household. This hatred would seep into young George's upbringing, teaching him from earliest childhood to view his grandfather with suspicion and contempt. Frederick hired tutors who filled the boy's mind with ideas about kingship and duty. They taught him that a monarch must be moral, that he must purify public life, that personal virtue mattered more than political cunning. These lessons would shape George's entire reign, for better and for worse. The prince learned to read rather late, not managing the skill until age 11, which concerned his parents and tutors deeply. They wondered if perhaps the boy's mind worked differently, slower perhaps, though thorough in its deliberations. Tragedy struck when George was just 12 years old. His father, Prince Frederick, died suddenly from complications following a lung injury. In an instant, young George transformed from prince to heir apparent. The weight of future kingship settled upon his narrow shoulders. His mother, Princess Augusta, became intensely protective, surrounding her son with advisors she trusted, particularly John Stuart, the Earl of Bute, who would become both mentor and controversial influence on the young prince. George's education intensified after his father's death. He studied science with particular enthusiasm, becoming the first British monarch to make scientific inquiry part of his formal training. He established his own astronomical observatory, spending hours watching the heavens through telescopes, calculating the movements of planets and stars. This scientific curiosity would remain throughout his life, even during his darkest periods of illness. The young heir developed into a serious, somewhat awkward young man. He spoke with careful deliberation, choosing his words as if each one carried tremendous weight. His tutors noted his stubbornness, his difficulty in forming friendships, his tendency toward rigid thinking. Yet they also observed his genuine desire to be a good king, to serve his country with honor and dedication. In 1760, when George was just 22 years old, his grandfather, King George II, died suddenly. The old king had visited the toilet early one morning and suffered a fatal heart attack while straining on the royal privy, an ignominious end that would, ironically, foreshadow similarly undignified royal deaths to come. Young George inherited the throne, becoming King George III, ruler of Great Britain and Ireland, and Elector of Hanover. The new king immediately faced expectations and pressures that would have crushed a less determined man. The 7 Years' War still raged across Europe and the colonies. Parliament squabbled endlessly over policy. The public scrutinized every action their young monarch took. George threw himself into his duties with intense dedication, reading every government paper, attending every meeting, inserting himself into policy decisions with an enthusiasm that often annoyed his ministers. Just weeks after ascending the throne, George married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a German princess he had never met before their wedding day. She arrived in England speaking no English, knowing nothing of British customs, barely 17 years old and terrified. Yet somehow, against all odds, the marriage worked. George genuinely loved Charlotte, remaining faithful to her throughout their marriage, a rarity among kings. They would have 15 children together, 13 of whom survived to adulthood, filling their homes with the noise and chaos of a large family. George took his role as king with profound seriousness. He believed God had chosen him for this position, that divine providence required him to be virtuous, moral, and dedicated to his people's welfare. He read voraciously, building an enormous personal library that would eventually contain 65,000 volumes. He opened this library to scholars, encouraging learning and intellectual pursuit. He patronized the arts, founding the Royal Academy and supporting artists, musicians, and writers. But beneath this dedication, something stirred. The first hints of illness appeared when George was in his mid-20s. After a bout of fever, he began behaving strangely, talking rapidly, saying inappropriate things, showing agitation that seemed to come from nowhere. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the episode passed. Everyone forgot about it, dismissing it as stress or overwork. The king threw himself into governance during the 1760s and 70s. He opposed American colonial independence with passionate intensity, believing that allowing the colonies to break away would destroy the empire and dishonor the crown. When the American Revolutionary War erupted in 1775, George supported it wholeheartedly, though he did not develop the policies that led to war. Those came from Parliament, from ministers like Lord North, who implemented taxation schemes and military strategies that drove the colonists to rebellion. The loss of America in 1783 devastated George. He privately admitted that America was lost, acknowledging that the former colonies had become Britain's successful rivals in trade and commerce. This defeat weighed heavily on his mind, adding to growing stress that manifested in strange ways. Sleeplessness, agitation, periods of unusual behavior that came and went, like storms across a troubled sea. Then, in 1788, when George was 50 years old, everything changed. The king fell seriously ill with symptoms that terrified everyone who witnessed them. It began in June, with what doctors diagnosed as biliary complaints, stomach pains, cramping, digestive distress. They sent him to Cheltenham to take the waters, a common treatment for such ailments. He seemed to recover, returning to his duties with renewed energy. But in October, the symptoms returned with terrifying intensity. The king experienced severe abdominal pain that left him doubled over in agony. His feet swelled grotesquely. His eyes turned yellow with jaundice. His urine turned strange colors, sometimes blue, sometimes brown, always wrong. He couldn't concentrate on affairs of state, losing his focus mid-sentence, forgetting what he was saying, repeating himself endlessly. The mental symptoms proved even more disturbing. George began talking incessantly, his words tumbling out in torrents that made no sense. He spoke for hours without stopping, his voice growing hoarse and raspy. Observers noted that he couldn't seem to control his speech, that words poured from him like water from a broken dam. He became hypersexual, making inappropriate advances to ladies of the court, behaving in ways that shocked and embarrassed everyone around him. His memory failed catastrophically. He would start conversations with people he'd just spoken to moments before, having completely forgotten the previous exchange. He couldn't remember appointments, agreements, or important decisions. His family watched in horror as the king they knew disappeared before their eyes, replaced by someone increasingly unrecognizable. The situation reached a crisis point during a dinner with the Prince of Wales. Throughout the meal, George berated his eldest son, criticizing him viciously in front of Queen Charlotte and the princesses. The evening culminated when the king suddenly grabbed his son and threw him bodily to the floor. The shocked family realized that George had completely lost control, that his illness had progressed beyond anything they could manage within the palace walls. Doctors descended upon the king like carrion birds. They had no idea what caused his symptoms, no effective treatments to offer. They prescribed emetic tartar, an antimony-based medicine designed to induce vomiting, thinking that purging the body would cure the illness. They blistered his legs, applying caustic powder to his skin until painful blisters formed, believing this would draw out evil humors. They restrained him when he grew violent, sometimes sitting on him to hold him down during convulsions. The king's senior physician, Dr. George Baker, recommended moving George to the White House at Kew, a smaller residence where he could be treated away from public view. In November 1788, they transported the king to Kew, where a new doctor took charge, the Reverend Francis Willis, a clergyman who had established a private asylum in Lincolnshire. Willis employed methods that modern observers would consider torture. He used a special chair, essentially a straitjacket, that completely immobilized the patient. When the king resisted or spoke out of turn, Willis had him gagged. He threatened George constantly, using fear and intimidation to try to control the royal patient's behavior. He told the king that he was mad, that he needed to be restrained like any other lunatic, that his royal status meant nothing in the face of insanity. George suffered terribly under this treatment. He begged to be released, pleaded with his doctors to show mercy, promised he would behave if only they would remove the restraints. His pleas went unanswered. Day after day, week after week, he endured confinement, medical procedures that brought only pain, and the constant humiliation of being treated like a dangerous animal rather than a king. Meanwhile, Parliament faced a constitutional crisis. Without a functioning monarch, who would govern? The Prince of Wales pushed to be made regent, effectively taking his father's place. William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister, resisted, believing the king might recover and wanting to limit the prince's power. Factions formed, accusations flew. The government teetered on the edge of chaos. Then, in February 1789, something miraculous happened. The king's symptoms began to subside. His mind cleared, his behavior normalized, his physical symptoms retreated. By March, he had recovered sufficiently to resume his duties. The nation rejoiced, celebrating the king's return with services of thanksgiving in churches across the realm. George himself seemed bewildered by what had happened to him, remembering only fragments of his illness, horrified by what he learned of his behavior during those dark months. Life returned to something resembling normalcy. George resumed his duties with characteristic dedication. He reconciled with the Prince of Wales, though their relationship remained strained. He devoted himself to his family, his studies, his role as monarch. But the shadow of illness never fully lifted. Everyone knew it could return, that the king's mind remained fragile, that another episode might strike at any moment. For the next 12 years, George remained relatively healthy. He continued his scientific pursuits, his support of the arts, his involvement in governance. He navigated Britain through the tumultuous period of the French Revolution, maintaining stability even as chaos consumed France. He faced down Jacobite uprisings, managed wars with France and Spain, dealt with endless political intrigues and parliamentary battles. In 1801, the illness returned. This time, the trigger seemed clear. A fierce disagreement with Prime Minister William Pitt over Catholic emancipation. George believed his coronation oath required him to maintain the rights and privileges of the Church of England. When Pitt proposed allowing Roman Catholics full civil rights, including service in the armed forces, George opposed the measure with passionate intensity. The stress of this conflict, combined with ongoing worries about the war with France, triggered another severe episode. Once again, the king experienced the terrible symptoms: stomach pain, swelling, discolored urine, racing thoughts, uncontrollable speech. Once again, doctors subjected him to brutal treatments. Once again, the nation held its breath, wondering if their king would recover. And once again, after several months, the symptoms retreated, allowing George to return to his duties. But this recovery proved less complete than the first. The king's mind retained strange quirks, odd behaviors that hadn't existed before. He became more rigid in his thinking, more stubborn in his opinions, more difficult for his ministers to manage. His family noticed changes in his personality, subtle shifts that suggested permanent damage from the illness and its treatments. Another episode struck in 1804, briefer than the previous ones, but still deeply concerning. Then, in 1810, tragedy triggered the final, devastating episode that would last until the king's death. Princess Amelia, George's youngest and favourite daughter, fell gravely ill with consumption. The king visited her constantly, watching helplessly as she wasted away. When she died in November 1810, George's mind shattered completely. This time, there would be no recovery. The symptoms that had come and gone before now settled in permanently. The king retreated into a world of confusion and delusion, unable to recognize family members, unable to understand where or when he was. He lived increasingly in the past, carrying on conversations with people long dead, reliving events from decades earlier as if they were happening now. By 1811, everyone accepted that George would never recover. Parliament passed the Regency Act, making the Prince of Wales regent with full royal powers. George III remained king in name only, a tragic figure confined to apartments in Windsor Castle, cared for by attendants who treated him with kindness even as his mind wandered further from reality. The final decade of George's life passed in a fog of dementia and isolation. He went blind from cataracts, unable to see the world around him. He went deaf, unable to hear voices or music. He existed in darkness and silence, accompanied only by the phantoms of his deteriorating mind. His white hair and beard grew long and wild, giving him the appearance of some ancient prophet or hermit. Attendants noted that he seemed sometimes peaceful, living in memories or dreams that brought him comfort. Meanwhile, Britain fought and won the Napoleonic Wars. The Industrial Revolution transformed the nation. The empire expanded across the globe. All of this happened without George's knowledge or participation. The king, who had once involved himself in every detail of governance, now knew nothing of the world outside his rooms. On January 29th, 1820, in the early evening, King George III died at Windsor Castle. He was 81 years old and had reigned for 59 years, 3 months, and 2 days. longer than any previous British monarch. His death came quietly, peacefully, a merciful release from years of suffering and confusion. But what had caused this terrible illness? For nearly 2 centuries, this question haunted historians and medical researchers. The king's contemporaries assumed he was simply mad, that he suffered from some form of insanity. 19th century physicians reviewing the case also concluded he had manic depressive psychosis, a mental illness that produced his symptoms. Then, in 1966, 2 psychiatrists named Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter proposed a radical new theory. After studying over 100 volumes of medical records from George's illnesses, they announced that the king had not been mentally ill at all. Instead, they claimed he suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic blood disorder that affects the body's ability to produce hemoglobin. The theory seemed to fit perfectly. Porphyria causes many of the symptoms George experienced: abdominal pain, muscle weakness, confusion, hallucinations, anxiety, seizures. Most tellingly, it can cause urine to turn reddish or purple, which matched reports of the king's discolored urine. The disorder is genetic, periodic, and unpredictable, explaining why George had episodes separated by years of normalcy. McAlpine and Hunter's book became a bestseller. Their theory gained widespread acceptance in medical and historical circles. Alan Bennett's play The Madness of George III, later adapted into the film The Madness of King George, popularized the porphyria diagnosis. For decades, it became accepted fact that George III had suffered from porphyria, not mental illness. Then, in 2005, scientists tested samples of George's hair preserved from the time of his death. They hoped to extract DNA that might prove the porphyria theory. The DNA extraction failed, but the tests revealed something shocking: extraordinarily high levels of arsenic in the king's hair, hundreds of times higher than normal. This discovery opened new possibilities. Arsenic is a known trigger for porphyria in people who carry the genetic predisposition. The source of the arsenic likely came from the very medicines doctors gave George to treat his symptoms. Emetic tartar, that antimony-based compound they prescribed so liberally, was often contaminated with arsenic. The doctors trying to cure the king might have actually been poisoning him, making his symptoms worse with every dose. But some researchers questioned whether George had porphyria at all. They noted that McAlpine and Hunter had been selective in their evidence, emphasizing symptoms that fit porphyria while ignoring others that didn't. The discolored urine, for instance, might have come from medications rather than the disease itself. One medicine the king took, gentian violet, is known to turn urine blue. More recently, researchers at St. George's University of London proposed yet another explanation. After analyzing thousands of George's handwritten letters using computer diagnostics, they concluded the king suffered from bipolar disorder, specifically acute mania. The evidence seemed compelling. During his episodes of illness, George's sentences became extraordinarily long, sometimes stretching to 400 words without a break. He repeated himself constantly, used more complex vocabulary, and showed classic signs of manic speech patterns. Modern psychiatrists recognize these symptoms immediately: the non-stop talking, the hypersexuality, the grandiose ideas, the inability to control one's behavior, all classic markers of the manic phase of bipolar disorder. The periodic nature of George's illness, with episodes separated by years of normalcy, also fits bipolar disorder perfectly. Furthermore, arsenic poisoning can trigger or worsen mental illness. The high arsenic levels in George's hair suggest he suffered chronic poisoning that may have damaged his brain and triggered or exacerbated an underlying bipolar condition. The treatments his doctors prescribed, the restraints, the intimidation, the constant stress, would have made everything worse. So what truly afflicted King George III? Was it porphyria triggered by arsenic poisoning? Was it bipolar disorder worsened by toxic medications? Was it some combination of factors? A perfect storm of genetic predisposition, environmental triggers, and harmful medical interventions? We will likely never know with certainty. What we do know is that George III suffered terribly. His illness robbed him of his dignity, his agency, his freedom. It subjected him to treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. It took from him the final decade of his life, leaving him blind, deaf, confused, and alone. It overshadowed his many accomplishments, his scientific patronage, his dedication to duty, his stable family life, his role in expanding the British Empire. History remembers him as the Mad King, the monarch who lost America and lost his mind. But perhaps we should remember him differently, as a man who tried his best, who faced terrible illness with courage when he could, who suffered in ways we can barely imagine. The madness of King George III was not just his personal tragedy, but a window into an era when medicine could not help, when mental illness meant torture rather than treatment, when even a king could not escape the cruelties inflicted in the name of healing. The king whose body exploded. Henry, later known as King Henry VIII of England, died on January 28, 1547, in the Palace of Whitehall, London. But the truly bizarre story doesn't begin with his death. It begins with what happened to his corpse afterward, a tale so grotesque and shocking that it seems impossible to believe, yet every horrifying detail is documented in historical records. By the time of his death, the once athletic monarch had become a grotesque parody of his former self. Henry weighed approximately 400 pounds, his waist measuring 54 inches around. His body was covered with festering, pus-filled boils that emitted such a terrible stench that courtiers could barely stand to be near him. His legs had developed massive ulcers that never healed, constantly oozing foul-smelling fluids that required daily dressing changes. The transformation from vigorous young king to bloated, diseased invalid had taken decades. In his youth, Henry stood over 6 feet tall, magnificently built, considered one of the handsomest princes in Europe. He excelled at jousting, hunting, tennis, and all manner of athletic pursuits. But a series of jousting accidents, particularly a severe head injury in 1536, may have caused traumatic brain damage that altered his personality and contributed to his eventual decline. As Henry aged, he ate prodigiously, consuming meals that would have defeated 3 normal men. The Tudor court celebrated excess, and the king indulged every appetite without restraint. He grew larger year by year, his weight making physical activity impossible, his mobility eventually requiring mechanical devices to move him around the palace. The leg ulcers, possibly caused by osteomyelitis or chronic venous insufficiency, made walking agonizing. Some historians suggest he developed type 2 diabetes. Others point to possible syphilis. Still others believe the jousting injuries caused long-term complications. By January 1547, it was clear the king was dying. He had been declining for months, his health deteriorating rapidly. On January 27th, his condition became critical. But there existed a law that made the situation particularly terrifying for the doctors. Predicting the king's death counted as treason, punishable by execution. No physician dared tell Henry he was dying, even as he clearly approached his final hours. Finally, Sir Anthony Denny, the king's loyal groom of the stool, essentially his personal attendant who handled the most intimate aspects of royal life, including accompanying the king to the toilet, gathered enough courage to tell his master the truth. Denny knelt by the dying king's bedside and gently informed him that, in man's judgment, he was not likely to live. He urged Henry to remember his sins and make his peace with God. as becometh every good Christian man to do. Henry responded with remarkable composure, saying he believed Christ would pardon his sins through his infinite mercy and goodness. He expressed regret for his life's actions, but trusted in God's forgiveness. When asked if he wished to see anyone, perhaps a learned man to help him prepare for death, Henry said he would see only one person, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But by the time they could summon Cranmer, the king had slipped into unconsciousness. Cranmer arrived to find Henry barely alive, unable to speak. The Archbishop asked the king to give some sign that he trusted in Christ for salvation. Henry squeezed Cranmer's hand, his final gesture before dying. At 2 a.m. on January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII breathed his last. He was 55 years old and had reigned for 37 years and 9 months. Now the real problems began. The law required that the king's death be kept secret for several days while arrangements were made for the succession. Young Prince Edward, not yet 10 years old, needed to be secured and prepared for coronation. The court needed time to organize the transition of power, so Henry's death remained a closely guarded secret for 3 full days. During this time, court embalmers set to work on the royal corpse. They attempted to preserve the massive body through the crude methods available in the 16th century. They removed Henry's internal organs, heart, lungs, liver, stomach, intestines, all extracted and presumably buried separately according to custom. They stuffed the body cavity with sawdust, resin, and aromatic herbs, trying to slow decomposition and mask the inevitable odors. But so much time had passed between death and embalming that decomposition had already begun its work. Henry's body, already in poor condition before death, had started to rot. The embalmers did what they could, but they were fighting a losing battle against biology. They wrapped the prepared body in ceracloth, fabric soaked in wax, then encased it in lead to contain the smell and prevent leakage. This lead-lined coffin was then placed inside a larger wooden coffin, creating a double barrier. On January 31st, 3 days after his death, the court finally announced that King Henry VIII had died. Parliament received the news with tears and mourning, at least publicly. Privately, many felt relief that the tyrant's reign had ended. Henry's reign had been marked by tremendous violence. He had executed 2 of his 6 wives, along with several close advisers, numerous nobles, and countless others who crossed him. His break with Rome and dissolution of the monasteries had torn England apart. His paranoia and rage had made the court a dangerous place, where anyone might fall from favour and lose their head. The body lay in state in the presence chamber at Whitehall Palace, surrounded by burning tapers, while plans were made for the funeral. They placed a life-size effigy of the king on top of the coffin, complete with real crown and robes, representing Henry as he had appeared in life, or at least as he had appeared before his final decline. Bells tolled mourning knells across the kingdom. The entire nation performed elaborate theatrical grief for a king many had feared and few had loved. 10 days after his death, the funeral procession began its journey from Westminster to Windsor, where Henry would be buried with his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, whom he considered his one true love because she had given him a surviving son. The procession was magnificent, stretching 4 miles long, with over 1,000 mourners on horseback and hundreds more on foot. They carried the coffin on a massive gilded chariot pulled by 8 great horses. A canopy of estate covered the coffin, protecting it from the elements. The route had been carefully prepared, roads repaired, bridges reinforced, trees cut back so the banners wouldn't catch on branches. At Windsor, railings kept back the crowds that gathered to watch this historic spectacle. Thousands of London's poor received payment to pray for the dead king's soul. Essentially, the court paid people to perform grief. The procession moved slowly, taking 2 days to cover the relatively short distance from Westminster to Windsor. On the first night, the funeral party stopped at Syon House in Middlesex for the body to rest overnight before completing the journey. The coffin was placed in the chapel, surrounded by guards and clergy who were meant to keep vigil through the night. It was here, in the darkness of Syon House Chapel, that something horrific happened. According to contemporary accounts, the coffin broke open during the night. Perhaps the wooden outer coffin cracked under the tremendous weight. Perhaps the lead inner coffin, weakened by the body's decomposition, developed a rupture. Perhaps gas pressure from the decomposing corpse built up inside the sealed container until something gave way. Whatever the cause, witnesses reported that in the morning they found the coffin had burst open. Blood and putrid bodily fluids had leaked out, pooling on the chapel floor. The smell must have been overwhelming, a mixture of death, rot, and the spices used in embalming. And then came the most grotesque detail of all. Stray dogs had somehow entered the chapel during the night. They had licked up the royal remains that had spilled from the coffin. This detail shocked everyone who heard it, not just because of its disgusting nature, but because it fulfilled a prophecy. 12 years earlier, in 1535, a friar named William Peto had preached a sermon at Greenwich that infuriated King Henry. In this sermon, Peto had compared Henry to King Ahab from the Bible, and Anne Boleyn to Jezebel, Ahab's wicked wife. Peto had predicted that dogs would lick Henry's blood, just as they had licked Ahab's blood in the biblical story. Henry had been furious at this prophecy, considering it treasonous. He had Peto arrested and nearly executed for daring to speak against the king. But now, 12 years later, as dogs licked the dead king's bodily fluids from the chapel floor, those present remembered Peto's words. The prophecy had come true in the most literal and disgusting way possible. Some saw it as divine judgment, God's punishment for Henry's treatment of the church and his many victims. The funeral party did their best to clean up the mess and repair the coffin. They could not delay the journey further. The body would only decompose more with each passing hour. On February 15th, the patched coffin arrived at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, watched from the Queen's closet on the upper level of the chapel, dressed in blue velvet robes and a purple bodice. What must she have thought, watching the burial of her third husband, this man who had had the power to execute her if he had chosen? The funeral service was conducted by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, whom Henry had actually excluded from court before his death. Gardiner had fallen from favour, yet here he was, presiding over the king's final rites. The officials who had served Henry for 37 years said their farewells as the massive coffin was lowered into the vault, prepared beneath the chapel floor. They buried Henry beside Jane Seymour, his third wife, who had died in 1537, shortly after giving birth to Prince Edward. Of all his 6 wives, Henry had requested to be buried with Jane because only she had given him what he desperately wanted, a legitimate male heir who survived infancy. Never mind that he had also loved her, or that she had died before she could disappoint him the way his other wives had. In Henry's mind, Jane's value lay in the son she provided. The vault beneath the choir floor was meant to be temporary. Henry had commissioned an elaborate tomb to be built, one that would rival or exceed the magnificent monuments of other great kings. He had hired 3 different artists over the years to design and construct this monument to his glory. First came Pietro Torrigiano, the Italian artist who had previously created the beautiful tomb for Henry's parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But Torrigiano was temperamental and left England after a disagreement about payment, taking with him the £1,000 Henry had already given him. Next, Henry commissioned Jacopo Sansovino to design a new tomb in 1527. This design was described as grand and expensive, made of black touchstone and white marble with copper and gilt decorations. It would feature large effigies of the king and queen, with pillars of serpentine and alabaster, and a sculpture of Henry on horseback under a decorative arch. 134 smaller sculptures of religious figures would adorn it. But this tomb, too, was never completed. Finally, Henry turned to Benedetto da Rovezzano, commissioning yet another design. Work proceeded slowly, and by the time of Henry's death, the tomb remained unfinished. After Henry died, no one seemed interested in completing his monument. His son Edward VI was too young to care. His daughter Mary the I had too many other concerns during her brief, troubled reign. His daughter Elizabeth had no desire to glorify a father who had executed her mother and declared her illegitimate, so the temporary burial became permanent. King Henry VIII, one of England's most powerful and terrifying monarchs, rests in an unmarked grave beneath the choir floor of St. George's Chapel. The only indication of his burial place is a marble slab installed in the 19th century that marks the location where both Henry VIII and Charles I are buried, Charles having been placed in the same vault after his execution in 1649. The vault was opened one more time, in 1813, during construction work on a passage to a new royal vault. Workmen accidentally discovered the forgotten burial chamber. Present were the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, several canons from St. George's Chapel, and various workmen. They peered into the vault and saw multiple coffins, including Henry's. One witness, Canon Dalton, later reported that Henry's coffin had clearly burst open at some point. The lead had split, and the coffin's contents were visible. Dalton wrote that the coffin had been burst by the gases evolved by the corpse, a clinical way of describing the explosion that had occurred at Syon House centuries earlier. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Henry's skull through the damaged coffin. The sight must have been deeply disturbing, this glimpse of the once mighty king reduced to bones and decay. They resealed the vault without disturbing the coffins further. In 1837, a marble slab was placed on the choir floor to mark the burial location, though modern research suggests it might be slightly west of the actual vault. The exact location of Henry's remains remains somewhat uncertain, and the vault has not been opened since the 1813 incident. What causes a corpse to explode? The phenomenon is actually well documented and occurs more often than people realize. After death, bacteria in the intestines and stomach continue their work, breaking down tissue and producing gases, primarily methane, hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide. In a sealed container like a lead-lined coffin, these gases have nowhere to go. Pressure builds up inside the body cavity and inside the coffin itself. If the body has been embalmed, the process may slow, but not stop decomposition, especially if embalming was incomplete or the body was already beginning to decompose before treatment. Henry's body presented particular challenges. His enormous size, his many infected wounds and ulcers, and the delay before embalming all contributed to rapid decomposition. The embalmers of 1547 lacked the sophisticated chemical preservatives used by modern morticians. They relied on herbs, spices and resin, materials that might mask odors but couldn't truly halt bacterial activity. The wooden coffin, while strong, wasn't airtight. Gas could build up pressure until the wood cracked or split. The lead inner coffin, while more resistant, could develop weak points or ruptures, especially at seams, or if it had been imperfectly sealed. When the pressure finally exceeded the coffin's ability to contain it, the seal broke. The built-up gases escaped explosively, carrying with them fluids from the decomposing body. The account of dogs licking the spilled remains is particularly disturbing but entirely plausible. Tudor buildings, even chapels, were not sealed environments. Dogs and other animals roamed freely through most spaces. Stray dogs were common in every town and city. The chapel at Syon House, while meant to be guarded during the night, probably had doors or windows that a determined dog could enter. The smell of death and decay would have attracted any carnivorous animal. Some historians question whether the explosion actually occurred. They note that the story isn't mentioned in all contemporary accounts, that it might have been exaggerated or even invented to fulfill the prophecy about dogs licking the king's blood. The earliest detailed account comes from Charles Wriothesley's Chronicle, written close to the events. Later, chroniclers embellished the story, adding details that may or may not be accurate. However, the physical evidence from the 1813 opening of the vault suggests something definitely damaged Henry's coffin. Canon Dalton's observation about the burst lead coffin lends credibility to the explosion story. Whether it happened at Syon House or later in the vault at Windsor, the coffin clearly suffered catastrophic failure at some point, likely from gas pressure. There's a certain poetic justice to this grotesque end. Henry VIII had spent his life as a tyrant, executing anyone who displeased him, including 2 of his wives. He had dissolved hundreds of monasteries, destroying irreplaceable architecture and artifacts, dispossessing thousands of monks and nuns, all to enrich his treasury and consolidate his power. He had broken England away from the Catholic Church, not from genuine religious conviction, but because the Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment from his first wife. He had been vain, cruel, paranoid, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He had demanded absolute obedience, absolute respect, absolute veneration. He had commissioned grand tombs and monuments to ensure his glory would last forever. And in the end, his body exploded in its coffin, was licked by dogs, and ended up in an unmarked grave that was forgotten for centuries. The comparison to King Ahab proved eerily accurate. Ahab had been a wicked king who, influenced by his wife Jezebel, had led Israel into idolatry and evil. The prophet Elijah had pronounced God's judgment on Ahab, declaring that dogs would lick his blood. After Ahab died in battle, dogs indeed licked his blood from the chariot where he had bled out. Friar Peter had seen the parallel and dared to speak it aloud. Henry had tried to silence the prophecy through intimidation and threatened execution. But prophecies cannot be silenced by force, whether one sees divine judgment or simple biological processes in the explosion of Henry's coffin. The incident reveals something essential about power and mortality. No matter how mighty in life, all flesh returns to dust, or in Henry's case, to a mess of decomposing tissue, gas and bodily fluids. The crown protects no one from death's indignities. The richest tomb cannot prevent nature from claiming its due. King Henry VIII, who had terrified an entire nation, who had shaped the course of English history, who had married 6 times and executed 2 wives, ended as all humans end, as organic matter following the inevitable path of decay. The only difference was that his end proved even more undignified than most, his massive corpse creating such a spectacle of putrefaction that it became a cautionary tale told for centuries. Today, visitors to St. George's Chapel can see the marble slab marking Henry's burial place. They can stand above the vault, where his remains still rest, alongside his 3rd wife and the executed King Charles III. But they cannot see the tomb Henry envisioned, the grand monument he commissioned 3 times, but never saw completed. Instead, his memorial is the story itself, the bizarre, grotesque, oddly fitting tale of the king, whose body exploded, whose pride and vanity were reduced to carrion, for dogs, whose desperate attempts at immortality came to nothing beneath the cold stone floor. The queen with 6 fingers, who never had 6 fingers, Anne, later known as Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII and mother of Elizabeth I, has been dead for nearly 500 years. Yet one myth about her refuses to die, the claim that she had 6 fingers on one hand. This story has taken on a life of its own, repeated in books, portrayed in films, and believed by millions. Yet the evidence overwhelmingly shows it to be false, a piece of Catholic propaganda so successful that it has survived centuries past its original purpose. The story begins not with Anne herself, but with a man who never met her and who had every reason to lie about her. Nicholas Sander was born around 1530, 6 years before Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536. He grew up to become a devout Catholic scholar during the reign of Anne's daughter, Elizabeth II. But Elizabeth had made England Protestant, and Sander, like many Catholics, went into exile rather than accept the new religious order. From his exile, Sander devoted himself to attacking Elizabeth and everything she represented. In 1585, nearly 50 years after Anne's death, he published a book titled De origine ac progressu schismatis Anglicani, The Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism. This book was pure propaganda, designed to discredit the Protestant Reformation and Elizabeth's legitimacy as queen. In this book, Sander described Anne Boleyn in terms meant to evoke horror and revulsion. According to his account, Anne was rather tall of stature with black hair and an oval face of sallow complexion, as if troubled with jaundice. She had a projecting tooth under her upper lip, and on her right hand 6 fingers. There was a large wen, a tumour or wart, under her chin, and therefore to hide its ugliness, she wore a high dress covering her throat. This description served a specific purpose. In Tudor England, as in most of medieval and early modern Europe, people believed that physical deformities marked a person as evil or cursed by God. The witch-hunting manuals of the period explicitly stated that witches bore marks of their allegiance to Satan, extra digits, strange growths, unusual marks on their skin. By describing Anne as having 6 fingers and a large growth on her neck, Sander was effectively branding her as a witch and monster. The logic of the propaganda went like this. If Anne was a witch or devil-marked creature, then her seduction of Henry VIII becomes explained as demonic influence. The English Reformation, which Henry initiated in order to marry Anne after the Pope refused to annul his first marriage, was therefore not a legitimate religious movement, but the work of Satan working through Anne. And Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, must also be tainted by this evil heritage, making her an illegitimate ruler both legally and spiritually. But Sander's description contains obvious problems. First and most importantly, he was 6 years old when Anne died. He never saw her. Everything he wrote came second-hand or third-hand, filtered through decades and coloured by his own religious agenda. He had every motivation to portray Anne in the worst possible light, and no concern for accuracy. Second, his description contradicts itself. He claims Anne wore high-neck dresses to hide the wen under her chin, but high-neck dresses were not fashionable during Anne's lifetime. Women of the Tudor court wore low necklines decorated with jewellery. Anne herself was famous for wearing elaborate ropes of pearls and her distinctive bee pendant around her neck, adornments that would make no sense if she was trying to hide a large growth. The fashion for higher necklines only came into vogue after Anne's death. Third, and most telling, no contemporary source mentions Anne having 6 fingers. No one who actually knew her, who saw her daily at court, who watched her closely during her time as queen. None of these people ever mentioned such a dramatic deformity, and trust us, they would have mentioned it if it existed. We have numerous descriptions of Anne from people who actually knew her. George Wyatt, grandson of the poet Thomas Wyatt, who had been close to Anne, wrote a biography in the late 1590s based on interviews with people who had known her, including her former maid of honour, Anne Gainsford. Wyatt was specifically trying to counter Sanders' lies. He acknowledged that Anne had a small imperfection, some little show of a nail on one finger, a minor nail deformity that she was self-conscious about and tried to hide with her fashionable, long, hanging sleeves. This description is far more credible. A small extra nail or partially formed nail is a relatively minor birth defect that occurs occasionally. It's the sort of thing someone might be self-conscious about without it being immediately obvious or dramatically noticeable. Anne's long sleeves were actually fashionable for the time and would not have seemed unusual or suspicious. More importantly, we know what Henry VII's standards for female beauty were, and they were exacting. Henry was vain, particular, and obsessed with symbolism and divine favour. He believed God showed approval or disapproval through signs and omens. When he wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, one of his arguments was that God must disapprove of the marriage because their sons had died in infancy. Clearly divine punishment for an unlawful union. If Anne had had a sixth finger, a full extra digit, as Sander claimed, Henry would never have considered marrying her. In Tudor belief, such a deformity would be seen as a mark of God's disfavour, possibly even a sign of witchcraft or demonic influence. Henry was superstitious and deeply concerned with maintaining divine approval. He would not risk his soul and his kingdom on a woman marked as cursed or evil by such an obvious physical sign. Furthermore, Anne's enemies at court would have used any such deformity against her. She had many enemies, supporters of Catherine of Aragon, Catholics who opposed Henry's break with Rome, nobles who resented her rapid rise to power. These enemies watched her constantly, looking for any weakness, any scandal, any excuse to bring her down. A sixth finger would have been perfect ammunition, yet none of them ever mentioned it. When Anne was finally arrested and charged with adultery, incest and treason in 1536, false charges designed to give Henry an excuse to execute her and marry Jane Seymour. The prosecutors threw every possible accusation at her. They claimed she had committed adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. They claimed she had plotted to poison Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary. They claimed she had planned to murder Henry, but they never claimed she was a witch, never pointed to physical deformities as evidence of evil, never mentioned 6 fingers. The physical evidence also contradicts Sanders' claims. When Anne's remains were exhumed in 1876, during renovations at the Tower of London Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, medical examination found no abnormalities. The bones showed hands that were delicate and well-formed, with tapering fingers and no evidence of extra digits. The examination described the hand and foot bones as indicating delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. So where did Sander get his description? Most historians believe he either invented it whole cloth or cobbled it together from exaggerated rumours and Catholic propaganda that had circulated for decades after Anne's death. The Catholics who opposed Elizabeth needed to delegitimize her, and the easiest way to do that was to portray her mother as a monster. Over time, minor details became exaggerated. A small nail deformity became a 6th finger. A normal chin became a hideous wen. A slightly sallow complexion became jaundiced and yellow. Yet Sanders' lie has proven remarkably persistent. By the 19th century, the 6-finger story had become accepted as historical fact in many circles. Authors repeated it in books without checking sources. Artists included it in portraits and illustrations. It became part of Anne Boleyn's popular image, alongside her dark eyes and bee necklace. The myth got new life in the 20th century, when it appeared in the Book of Lists, a popular reference book published in 1977. The book claimed Anne had 3 nipples and 6 fingers, citing Sander as the source, but presenting it as established fact. The Book of Lists was hugely popular, especially with students looking for interesting facts to include in school papers. The false information spread widely, appearing on countless websites, in history documentaries, and in popular culture. Hollywood has had a complicated relationship with the 6-finger myth. Most productions ignore it, recognizing it as false, but some have included it, apparently finding it too interesting to leave out despite the lack of evidence. The 1972 film Henry VIII and His 6 Wives showed Anne with an extra finger, one of the only visual depictions to do so. More recently, some artistic representations have included it as a nod to the myth's persistence, even while acknowledging its false. The myth has taken on new forms in modern times. Some people argue that Anne must have had some kind of deformity because the story is so widespread, as if repetition creates truth. Others suggest she might have had polydactyly, the medical term for extra digits, but that it was surgically removed, which makes no sense given Tudor medical limitations and the fact that no records mention any such surgery. Still, others have tried to create a medical explanation, inventing an Anne Boleyn syndrome that supposedly links goiter and extra fingers. This syndrome appears in a few mid-20th century medical papers, but is not recognized by modern medicine, and appears to be based entirely on Sander's false description, rather than any actual medical evidence. The persistence of this myth reveals something important about how false information spreads and endures. Once a dramatic story enters the historical record, it takes on momentum. People repeat it because it's interesting, because it makes Anne seem more unusual and therefore more memorable. Authors include it in books because readers expect it. The myth becomes self-perpetuating, divorced from its origins in propaganda and malice. It also reveals the lasting power of propaganda. Sander wrote his lies 450 years ago to serve a specific political and religious agenda. That agenda is long dead. The religious conflicts of the 16th century resolved, the political struggles forgotten, yet his lies persist, still shaping how people think about Anne Boleyn. This is propaganda's final victory, to outlive its purpose and become accepted as truth simply through repetition and age. The real Anne Boleyn was remarkable enough without fictional deformities. She was intelligent, witty, and politically astute. She spoke French fluently and had been educated at the French court. She could play musical instruments, dance beautifully, and engage in sophisticated conversation. She had enough confidence and charisma to capture the attention of a king and keep it for years. She influenced religious reform in England, patronized scholars and artists, and raised her daughter Elizabeth to be one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne was also complex and flawed. She could be cruel to Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, treating the young woman with unnecessary harshness. She had a sharp tongue that made enemies. She was ambitious and used her sexuality strategically to maintain Henry's interest. She failed to produce the male heir that was the whole reason for Henry's break with Rome and his marriage to her, a failure that ultimately cost her life. These complexities make Anne human and historically fascinating. They make her a figure worth studying and understanding. The false stories, the 6 fingers, the extra nipples, the witchcraft accusations, distract from the real woman and reduce her to a carnival curiosity. They perpetuate the work of men like Nicholas Sander, who wanted to destroy her reputation and deny her daughter's legitimacy. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked the 6-finger myth, pointing out Sander's unreliability, the lack of contemporary evidence, the political motivations for the lie, and the physical evidence that contradicts it. Yet the myth persists in popular culture. appearing regularly in articles, social media posts, and casual conversations about Tudor history. It demonstrates how difficult it is to kill a good story, even when that story is demonstrably false. Perhaps the lesson of Anne Boleyn's phantom six finger is this: question dramatic claims, especially when they serve someone's agenda. Look for primary sources and contemporary evidence. Be suspicious of stories that emerge long after someone's death, particularly from their political or religious enemies. And remember that propaganda, once unleashed, can continue doing damage for centuries, long after everyone involved in creating it has turned to dust. Anne Boleyn had many real tragedies in her short life. Her failure to provide a male heir, her fall from grace, her unjust execution at age 35, her reputation destroyed by lies and rumours. She doesn't need fictional deformities to make her interesting. The truth of her life, free from Catholic propaganda and centuries of embellishment, is dramatic enough on its own. She was a woman who changed English history, whose daughter became one of the greatest monarchs England ever knew, and who died courageously, forgiving even those who sent her to the executioner's sword. The six-fingered queen never existed. The real Anne Boleyn, intelligent, ambitious, flawed, human, deserves to be remembered without Nicholas Sanders' lies obscuring her actual story. After nearly 500 years, perhaps it's time to finally let this particular myth die and remember Anne as she actually was, not as her enemies wished her to be. The queen whose sweet tooth rotted her smile. Elizabeth, later known as Queen Elizabeth I of England, ruled for 45 years, from 1558 until 1603, presiding over an era of unprecedented cultural flowering that bears her name. The Elizabethan age saw Shakespeare writing his plays, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the expansion of English power around the globe. But behind all this glory lurked a less glamorous problem. The Queen's teeth were rotting in her head, turning black as coal, and eventually falling out one by one. And incredibly, this dental disaster became a fashion, trend. To understand how a queen's dental decay became fashionable, we must first understand sugar's status in 16th century England. Sugar had existed in Europe since the Crusades brought it back from the Middle East in the 11th century, but it remained rare and phenomenally expensive for centuries, available only to the wealthiest families and used more as medicine than food. Physicians prescribed sugar to treat various ailments. Pharmacies sold it alongside other expensive drugs. This changed dramatically in the 1500s. English colonization of the Caribbean created sugar plantations worked by enslaved people, making production more efficient and supplies more regular. Sugar began arriving in England in quantities that made it more available, though still extraordinarily expensive. Only the wealthy could afford it, and they consumed it with voracious enthusiasm, eager to display their status through this exotic luxury. At the Tudor court, sugar became an obsession. Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, maintained a personal confectioner whose sole job was creating elaborate sugar treats for the king and his court. These weren't simple candies. They were massive sculptures made from sugar, edible artwork shaped like castles, animals, or mythological scenes. A single feast might feature dozens of these sugar sculptures, each one costing a fortune. The Earl of Northumberland reportedly ordered more than 2,000 pounds of sugar in a single year. To put this in perspective, sugar cost approximately the same as expensive spices or even pearls. 2,000 pounds of sugar represented a staggering expenditure, possible only for the extraordinarily wealthy, and it all got eaten, baked into pies and pastries, stirred into drinks, formed into candies and sweetmeats that were consumed at every meal. Elizabeth inherited her father's legendary sweet tooth. From earliest childhood, she loved sweets, candies, pastries, and anything sugar-filled. As she grew older and became queen, her access to unlimited quantities of the expensive sweetener meant she could indulge this craving without restriction. Every meal featured sugar-based treats. Between meals, she nibbled on candies. She never denied herself any sweet temptation. The problem, of course, was that nobody in 16th century England understood the connection between sugar consumption and dental decay. They knew teeth sometimes rotted and hurt, but they had no concept of bacteria, acid, or how sugar feeds the microorganisms that destroy tooth enamel. They didn't understand that every sweet treat was essentially feeding colonies of bacteria that produced acids, which dissolved the hard surface of teeth, creating cavities that grew larger and deeper until they reached the sensitive inner pulp. They did practice dental hygiene, after a fashion. People used toothpicks made from quills or wood to remove food particles. They wiped their teeth with cloth to clean off visible debris. Some used abrasive mixtures to try to polish their teeth. Combinations of pumice stone, brick dust, coral, or other rough materials rubbed directly on tooth enamel. These abrasive cleaners actually made things worse, scraping away the protective enamel layer and making teeth more vulnerable to decay. Worst of all, some wealthy people, including Elizabeth, used sugar-based tooth powders. That's right, they brushed their teeth with sugar, thinking it would clean and whiten them. It's difficult to imagine a practice more perfectly designed to destroy dental health. They might as well have gargled with battery acid. The sugar paste provided the perfect food source for bacteria, while the act of brushing spread it thoroughly across every tooth surface. Elizabeth's dental problems likely began in her 20s or 30s, though sources don't mention them in her younger years. The damage accumulated slowly, invisibly at first. A little sensitivity here, a small discoloration there, minor problems that the Queen ignored while continuing her sugar consumption unabated. But tooth decay is progressive. Once started, it accelerates. Small cavities become large ones. Surface damage penetrates to the root. Bacteria spread from tooth to tooth. By the time Elizabeth reached her 50s and 60s, the damage had become impossible to hide. Multiple sources document the horrifying state of the Queen's mouth in her later years. In 1599, when Elizabeth was 65 years old, a German traveller named Paul Hentzner visited England and met the Queen. He later wrote a description that has become infamous. Her face oblong, fair but wrinkled. Her eyes small, yet black and pleasant. Her nose a little hooked. Her teeth black, a defect the English seem to suffer from because of their great use of sugar. Hentzner's observation about sugar causing black teeth shows that at least some people had made the connection between sugar consumption and dental problems, but this knowledge didn't translate into behavior change. The status symbol of being able to afford sugar outweighed concerns about dental health. If anything, having black, rotten teeth became a badge of honor among the wealthy, proof that you could afford to eat enough sugar to destroy your smile. A French ambassador who met Elizabeth when she was 64 described her teeth as very yellow and unequal. Other sources mention that many of her teeth had fallen out entirely by this point in her life. The tooth loss became severe enough that it affected her speech. Foreign ambassadors reported difficulty understanding her because her missing teeth changed how she pronounced words. Imagine trying to conduct delicate diplomatic negotiations through the slurring speech of a woman with half her teeth missing. Elizabeth was vain about her appearance, as most monarchs were. She carefully controlled her public image, commissioning portraits that showed her as eternally youthful and beautiful, even as she aged. She forbade artists from painting her likeness without official approval, wanting to ensure that only flattering images circulated. The rainbow portrait, painted around 1600 when Elizabeth was nearly 70, shows her as young and radiant, with no hint of wrinkles, age spots, or dental problems. These official portraits bore no resemblance to reality. To hide the sunken appearance that tooth loss created, Elizabeth stuffed cloth or cotton into her cheeks during public appearances, creating the illusion of a fuller face. This practice must have been uncomfortable and made speaking even more difficult. But vanity demanded it. A hollow-cheeked, toothless monarch projected weakness. Elizabeth needed to appear strong and vigorous even as her body betrayed her. The dental problems caused real suffering beyond cosmetic concerns. Tooth decay is painful, especially before modern pain relievers. Cavities that reach the tooth's nerve cause excruciating pain, throbbing, sharp, constant agony that makes eating, speaking, even thinking difficult. Infections in decayed teeth cause abscesses, swollen pockets of pus that create pressure and fever. Multiple bad teeth meant Elizabeth likely lived with chronic pain for years, yet she apparently refused dental treatment for much of her life. The Queen had a terror of dentists, or rather, of barber surgeons, since specialized dentists didn't exist yet. Any tooth that needed removing was pulled by a surgeon using brutal methods. They had no anesthesia, no painkillers beyond alcohol. The patient sat in a chair while the surgeon used large pliers to grip the tooth and wrenched it from the jaw. The process was agonizing, bloody, and dangerous. The surgeon might break the tooth, leaving fragments in the jaw, or might damage surrounding teeth while pulling. One famous story illustrates Elizabeth's fear of this procedure. When she finally agreed that a particularly painful tooth needed removing, she refused to proceed until she saw someone else undergo the procedure first. One of her bishops, accounts vary on which one, agreed to sacrifice one of his own healthy teeth to prove the process wasn't unbearable. Only after watching the bishop have a tooth pulled did Elizabeth allow the barber surgeon to approach her with his pliers. One can only imagine the bishop's mixed feelings about this particular form of service to his queen. As Elizabeth's teeth rotted and fell out, something bizarre happened. Black teeth became fashionable. The logic was simple. If the Queen had black teeth, it must be because she could afford to eat massive amounts of expensive sugar. Therefore, black teeth indicated wealth and status. The Queen's dental disaster became a trend among the upper classes, who desperately wanted to look wealthy. People who couldn't afford enough sugar to naturally rot their teeth, still the vast majority of the population, began artificially blackening them. They used soot, ash, and other dark substances to paint their teeth black, creating the illusion of sugar-stained dental decay. Imagine being so desperate to appear wealthy that you deliberately made your teeth look rotten. It represents one of history's most bizarre fashion trends, and it lasted for decades among the English upper classes. Meanwhile, the poor had healthier teeth than the rich. Peasants and working-class people couldn't afford sugar. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, vegetables, some meat, cheese, foods that, while not particularly nutritious by modern standards, at least didn't actively destroy tooth enamel. As a result, a poor farmer likely had better teeth at 60 than a wealthy noble or the Queen herself. But nobody envied the farmer. Better to have rotten teeth and wealth than healthy teeth and poverty. The irony wasn't lost on foreign visitors. Multiple accounts from travelers and ambassadors comment on the terrible state of English teeth, explicitly connecting it to excessive sugar consumption. Some viewed it as a peculiar English vice, like excessive drinking or gambling. Others saw it as a sign of decadence and decline, a great nation destroying its collective health in pursuit of sensory pleasure. Elizabeth's dental problems grew worse in her final years. By 1603, at age 69, she had lost most of her teeth. Contemporary accounts describe her as physically diminished, fragile, no longer the vigorous ruler she had been in her prime. In early March 1603, she fell into a strange state described by historians as a kind of stupor. She would sit on cushions for hours without moving, refusing food and rest, staring into space. William Camden, a contemporary historian, wrote that the Queen was seized with a kind of stupor, and that a kind of benumbedness seized upon her with a deep melancholy. Before she lost the ability to speak, Elizabeth reportedly spoke of terrible visions, nightmares that haunted her sleep, including visions of a man in flames. Whether these visions related to her dental pain, to infections from decayed teeth, or to other medical problems, we cannot know. Elizabeth died on March 24th, 1603. The exact cause of death remains uncertain. Possibly blood poisoning from dental infections, possibly pneumonia, possibly simply the accumulated effects of age and illness. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart era under James I. The sugar and rotten teeth trend finally died out after Elizabeth's death. James I didn't share Elizabeth's legendary sweet tooth, and without the Queen setting the fashion, blackening teeth gradually fell out of favour. As sugar became more common and less expensive over the following centuries, it lost its status symbol quality. By the 18th century, having rotten black teeth indicated poverty and poor hygiene rather than wealth. The meaning had completely reversed. Modern dental science allows us to understand exactly what happened to Elizabeth's teeth. She suffered from severe dental caries, cavities caused by Streptococcus mutans and other bacteria that metabolize sugar and produce lactic acid as waste. This acid dissolves hydroxyapatite, the mineral that makes tooth enamel hard. Once the enamel is breached, decay progresses into the dentin and eventually reaches the pulp, causing pain and infection. The sugar-based tooth powder Elizabeth used made everything worse. Besides directly feeding the bacteria, sugar creates an acidic environment in the mouth that accelerates enamel dissolution. The brushing motion spread bacteria throughout her mouth, ensuring no tooth escaped infection. It was a perfect storm of ignorance and self-inflicted damage. Could Elizabeth's dental problems have been prevented? Absolutely. If she had eaten less sugar, her teeth might have remained healthy into old age. If she had avoided sugar-based tooth powder, she wouldn't have accelerated the decay. If she had had decayed teeth pulled earlier, rather than waiting until they were unbearably painful, she might have prevented the spread of infection. But all of this required knowledge that didn't exist yet, and values, placing health over status, that ran counter to everything Tudor society believed. The story of Elizabeth's teeth reminds us that even queens are vulnerable to the consequences of ignorance and poor choices. All her power, wealth, and intelligence couldn't save her from the damage caused by sugar. Her insistence on indulging her sweet tooth, despite the consequences, shows a very human inability to resist temptation, even when we know better. Or in her case, when she should have known better once the damage became obvious. It also reveals how fashion and status-seeking can override common sense. The English aristocracy knew their teeth were rotting. They felt the pain, experienced the loss, understood that something was wrong. Yet they continued eating sugar and even artificially created the appearance of dental decay because looking wealthy mattered more than being healthy. This prioritization seems insane from our modern perspective, but every era has its own irrational status symbols and health-damaging trends. Finally, Elizabeth's dental disaster demonstrates the danger of leaders setting trends. Her personal choices, excessive sugar consumption, sugar-based tooth powder, refusing dental treatment, became fashionable throughout the upper classes because she was queen. Thousands of people destroyed their teeth imitating her, never questioning whether following royal fashion might not be wise in this particular case. Leadership comes with responsibility, including the responsibility to consider how one's example affects others. Queen Elizabeth achieved great things during her reign. She navigated religious conflicts, defeated the Spanish Armada, supported the arts, maintained stability in turbulent times, and left England stronger than she found it. But she also spent her final years in pain, partially deaf, with blackened stumps where teeth should have been, her speech slurred by missing teeth, her face sunken despite the cloth stuffed in her cheeks. All the power and glory in the world couldn't spare her this particular indignity, the wages of a sweet tooth in an era before modern dentistry. When royalty met ridiculous deaths, death comes for everyone, peasant and king alike. But throughout British history, some royal deaths have been so bizarre, so undignified, so utterly absurd that they seem like dark comedy rather than historical fact. From monarchs killed by toilet accidents to those murdered by severed heads, from wine barrel drownings to monkey bites, these stories reveal that no amount of royal blood protects one from fate's cruel sense of humour. Let us begin with perhaps the most ignominious death imaginable, dying on the toilet. This fate befell not one, but multiple British monarchs, proving that even the throne of England offers no protection from the dangers of the privy. Edmund, later known as Edmund Ironside, reigned as King of England for exactly 7 months, 2 days. He inherited a kingdom torn apart by Danish invasions and civil war. The year was 1016, and England had spent decades under assault from Viking raiders who had evolved from hit-and-run attackers into organized armies bent on conquest. Edmund fought bravely against these invaders, earning his nickname Ironside for his courage in battle and his seemingly indomitable will. In the spring of 1016, Edmund's father, King Ethelred the Unready, died, leaving the kingdom to his son. Edmund immediately faced Cnut, the Danish prince who claimed the English throne for himself. The two armies clashed repeatedly throughout that summer and autumn. Edmund won several battles, showing himself to be a skilled military commander. But Cnut's forces were formidable, and the constant warfare exhausted both sides. Finally, in November 1016, Edmund and Cnut agreed to divide the kingdom between them. Edmund would rule Wessex in the south, while Cnut controlled the rest of England. It was an uneasy peace, satisfying neither party, but offering respite from constant bloodshed. Both kings understood that eventually one would move against the other, but for now, they accepted the division. Edmund travelled to Oxford in late November, staying there as he consolidated his control over his portion of the kingdom. On the night of November 30th, 1016, the king rose in the darkness to answer nature's call. In that era, even a royal privy was a simple affair, a wooden seat positioned over a pit or cesspool. There were no bathrooms as we know them, no running water, no porcelain fixtures, just a wooden bench with a hole cut in it, positioned over a deep hole in the ground where waste collected. Edmund settled himself on this primitive toilet. Alone in the darkness, he had no idea that he was not alone. Hidden in the pit beneath the privy seat, covered in filth and breathing through some makeshift apparatus, crouched an assassin. The man had been waiting there for hours, perhaps days, enduring conditions almost beyond imagination. Medieval cesspits were hell on earth. The stench alone would overwhelm most people within minutes, not to mention the diseases, the rats, the unspeakable filth. But the assassin had motivation enough to endure it. Whether he was sent by Cnut, by one of Edmund's own treacherous nobles, or by some other enemy, we will never know with certainty. 12th century chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, writing a century after the events, claims the assassin was the son of ealdorman Edric Streona, a notorious traitor who had repeatedly switched sides between Edmund and Cnut. Others suggest different perpetrators. The truth is lost to history. What we do know, according to Henry of Huntingdon's account, is what happened next. As Edmund sat on the privy, The assassin reached up through the hole with a sword or long dagger. The first thrust struck Edmund from below, stabbing deep into his bowels. The king cried out in shock and agony. The assassin struck again, the blade slicing upward through Edmund's intestines. The king tried to rise, to escape, but the damage was catastrophic. The assassin left his weapon embedded in the king's body and fled through some escape route he had prepared. Servants found Edmund collapsed beside the privy, bleeding profusely from terrible wounds in his lower abdomen and buttocks. They carried him to his bed, but there was nothing to be done. In an era before antibiotics, before surgery, before even basic understanding of infection control, such wounds were invariably fatal. Even if Edmund had somehow survived the immediate trauma and blood loss, infection would have killed him within days. Stabbing through the bowels meant intestinal bacteria spilling into the body cavity, causing peritonitis, excruciating inflammation and infection that led to fever, sepsis, and death. Edmund Ironside died hours or perhaps days after the attack. He was probably in his mid-20s, had been king for 7 months, and died in the most undignified way imaginable. Murdered while relieving himself, stabbed from below by an assassin hiding in a pit of human waste. His death left Nut as sole ruler of all England, beginning the period of Danish rule that would last until 1042. The official explanation at the time was natural causes. Nobody wanted to admit that the king had been murdered in such an embarrassing fashion, but rumours spread immediately, and chroniclers preserved the story, perhaps embellishing it, but likely capturing the essential truth, that Edmund died violently and ignominiously, victim of an assassination plot so bizarre it seems like fiction. 7 centuries later, another King George faced a toilet-related death, though this one involved no assassins, just bad timing and physical strain. George II became King of Great Britain in 1727, succeeding his father George I. He was not born in Britain. He came from Hanover in what is now Germany, and he spoke English with a heavy German accent his entire life. The English public never quite warmed to this foreign king, but he presided over a period of tremendous growth and prosperity. During his reign, Britain became a dominant global power, expanding its empire while developing its economy and culture. George II holds several distinctions among British monarchs. He was the last king born outside Great Britain. He was the last to personally lead troops into battle, which he did in 1743 at the Battle of Dettingen during the War of Austrian Succession. He lived to age 76, a good long life for the 18th century, but none of these achievements feature in popular memory as much as the circumstances of his death. On the morning of October 25th, 1760, King George II followed his usual routine. He woke at 6 o'clock, had a cup of hot chocolate, then made his way to the toilet. The royal privy had advanced considerably since Edmund Ironside's day. It was a proper room with a chair-like seat, more comfortable and certainly more private, but the basic function remained the same. The king settled himself to attend to his morning constitutional. At age 76, after a lifetime of rich food and little exercise, his digestive system probably required some effort to function properly. He strained, pushing hard, trying to force his bowels to cooperate. This straining put tremendous pressure on his cardiovascular system. His blood pressure spiked. His heart, already weakened by age, struggled with the sudden demand. Suddenly, something inside the king's chest gave way. An aortic aneurysm, a weakened bulge in the wall of his largest artery, ruptured. Blood poured into his chest cavity. The pain would have been immediate and overwhelming, like being stabbed in the heart. George may have tried to cry out, to call for help, but the massive internal bleeding would have caused rapid shock and loss of consciousness. The king's valet, waiting outside, heard a loud crash from inside the privy. He rushed in to find King George II collapsed on the floor, having fallen from the toilet. The king was unconscious, breathing shallowly if at all, his face ashen. Servants summoned doctors, but there was nothing to be done. A ruptured aortic aneurysm is rapidly fatal even with modern medical intervention. In 1760, it was instantly fatal. George II was probably dead within minutes of the rupture, if not seconds. Thus ended the reign of King George II, not in battle, not in state, not even in bed, but collapsed on the bathroom floor, having literally strained himself to death on the toilet. It's the sort of death that would be darkly funny if it weren't so tragic. The king, who had personally led troops into battle, who had ruled an empire, who had lived through tremendous historical events, died performing the most mundane of bodily functions. The official announcements didn't dwell on the details, of course. They simply stated that the king had died suddenly of heart failure. But servants talked, and the story spread. Within days, all of London knew that the king had died on the privy. The tale passed into history as a cautionary reminder that dignity in death is not guaranteed, regardless of rank or title. Moving from toilet deaths to equally undignified but more dramatic ends, we encounter George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, who may or may not have drowned in a barrel of wine. George was born in 1449, the sixth son of Richard, Duke of York. His older brother became King Edward IV in 1461, after defeating the Lancastrians in the Wars of the Roses. Young George suddenly found himself the brother of a king, second in line to the throne after Edward's young son. This proximity to power would prove his undoing. George grew up privileged but perpetually dissatisfied. He believed he deserved more than he had, that his brother didn't appreciate him sufficiently, that he was being denied his rightful share of power and wealth. These resentments made him susceptible to manipulation by Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, for his role in placing Edward on the throne. Warwick turned against Edward IV over policy disagreements and foreign policy. He convinced George to join him in rebellion against the king. In 1469, George married Warwick's daughter Isabel without Edward's permission, a deliberate provocation. Together, George and Warwick raised an army and briefly succeeded in capturing Edward IV. But the rebellion fell apart. Edward escaped, rallied his supporters, and defeated Warwick's forces. George saw which way the wind was blowing and switched sides, betraying Warwick and returning to his brother's side. Edward, perhaps unwisely, forgave this treason. The king loved his brother despite everything and couldn't bring himself to punish George as he deserved. Warwick was killed in battle in 1471, seemingly ending George's opportunities for treason. But George couldn't help himself. He continued plotting, scheming, complaining about perceived slights. He spread rumours that Edward was illegitimate, suggesting their mother had committed adultery. He accused Edward's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, of witchcraft. He claimed the king's children were bastards. Each accusation was more outrageous than the last. The final straw came when George's wife Isabel died in 1476, possibly from complications of childbirth. George, in his grief and paranoia, accused one of Isabel's servants of poisoning her. He had the woman arrested, tried, and executed without proper legal process. Essentially, a judicial murder. This usurpation of royal authority could not be tolerated. Edward IV finally had enough. In January 1478, he had George arrested and brought before Parliament on charges of treason. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of plotting, spreading malicious rumours, threatening the succession, murdering an innocent servant. Parliament found George guilty. The sentence was death. But how should a duke, a brother to the king, be executed. Normally, treason meant being hanged, drawn, and quartered. A horrific public execution involving being partially hanged, then having your intestines pulled out while still alive, then being beheaded and cut into quarters. But this was too brutal for a duke of royal blood. Some members of the nobility earned the privilege of private execution, usually beheading. What happened next is unclear. George was taken to the Tower of London in February 1478. Shortly after, he was dead, but the manner of his death sparked rumours that have persisted for over 500 years. According to popular legend, George chose his own method of execution, drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Malmsey is a sweet wine from Madeira, and apparently George's favourite beverage. The story goes that Edward granted his brother the courtesy of choosing how he would die, and George, with dark humour or perhaps drunken bravado, requested to be drowned in his beloved wine. Whether this actually happened is debatable, but the story appears in multiple historical sources. The earliest written account comes from Fabian's Chronicle, published in 1516, which states that Clarence drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. A butt was a large barrel, typically holding about 120 gallons. William Shakespeare included the death in his play Richard III, written in 1597, where Clarence's murderers stab him, then throw him into a Malmsey barrel to drown. Some historians believe George was actually beheaded or possibly strangled. Standard execution methods that would leave no marks visible in a public viewing of the body. The wine barrel story might have been invented to add dark humour to the event, or perhaps to soften the reality of fratricide, a brother killing a brother over political necessity. But other historians point out that bones believed to be George's, discovered in the 19th century, showed no evidence of beheading. The skull was intact, the neck bones undamaged. If he wasn't beheaded and wasn't hanged publicly, how did he die? Drowning would leave no physical evidence on bones, and there's a certain poetic justice to the idea. A man who spent his life metaphorically drowning in wine, literally drowning in it at the end, will likely never know for certain. What we do know is that George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, died in the Tower of London in February 1478 at age 28, victim of his own treason and his brother's finally exhausted patience. Whether he drowned in wine, was beheaded in private, or died some other way, his death ended one of the most troubled lives in the Wars of the Roses. From wine to wildlife, we turn to one of history's strangest deaths, King Alexander I of Greece, killed by a monkey bite. Alexander became king in 1917 at age 23 under peculiar circumstances. He was never supposed to be king. His father, Constantine I, and his older brother Crown Prince George both lived and ruled. But World War I created complications. Constantine favoured Germany, or at least wanted Greece to remain neutral. The Allied powers, France, Britain and Russia, found this unacceptable. They essentially forced Constantine to abdicate, and because Crown Prince George shared his father's pro-German sympathies, the Allies demanded he be passed over for succession. This left Alexander, the second son, who had shown no particular interest in politics or strong opinions about the war. The Allies found him acceptable precisely because he was young, malleable, and unlikely to cause trouble. They installed him as king, while his father and brother went into exile. Everyone understood that Alexander was a puppet king, that real power rested with Prime Minister Eleutherios Venizelos, who enthusiastically supported the Allied cause. Alexander did his best in an impossible situation. He was 23 years old, suddenly king of a nation at war, with no real authority and constant pressure from his ministers. He couldn't even marry the woman he loved, Aspasia Manos, a commoner. without causing scandal. They married secretly in 1919, knowing his government would never approve a non-royal bride. After the war ended, Greece embarked on an ambitious campaign to expand its territory. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and Greek forces invaded Turkey to seize the Ionian coast, ancient Greek lands that had been under Turkish control for centuries. The campaign initially succeeded, capturing significant territory. Alexander, though king in name, had little involvement in these military adventures. On September 30th, 1920, King Alexander visited the royal gardens in Athens with his dog. It should have been a pleasant afternoon, a brief escape from the pressures of kingship. The gardens were peaceful, well maintained, a place where Alexander could relax and enjoy some privacy. But the gardens also housed various animals, including a pet monkey belonging to someone at court. Accounts vary on whether it was specifically the king's monkey or belonged to someone else. What happened next is tragically clear. Alexander's dog spotted the monkey, and with the typical enthusiasm of dogs seeing potential prey, rushed to attack it. The monkey, defending itself, fought back. Alexander, trying to separate the two animals and protect his dog, reached into the melee. The monkey, terrified and fighting for its life, bit Alexander on the leg. It seemed like a minor incident at first. The bite broke the skin, but didn't appear serious. Court physicians cleaned and dressed the wound. Alexander returned to his duties, thinking little of it. But within days, the wound became infected. In 1920, antibiotics didn't exist. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered for another 8 years. Wound infections that are trivial today could be fatal then. The bacteria from the monkey's mouth, likely including dangerous species that monkeys naturally carry, entered Alexander's bloodstream through the bite wound. His immune system fought valiantly, but the infection spread faster than his body could contain it. Alexander developed blood poisoning, septicemia. His temperature spiked. The wound became red, swollen, and inflamed. Red streaks appeared on his leg, tracking along blood vessels as the infection spread through his circulatory system. Doctors tried every treatment available to them, cleaning the wound, applying various poultices and medicines, draining pus. Nothing worked. The infection was beyond their ability to treat. For 3 weeks, Alexander lingered in agony as the infection ravaged his body. He suffered fevers, chills, delirium. His condition deteriorated day by day. Physicians summoned from across Europe tried their best, but septicemia was a death sentence in 1920. On October 25th, 1920, just 25 days after the monkey bite, King Alexander III of Greece died. He was 27 years old and had been king for 3 years. His death had enormous political consequences. Without Alexander on the throne, there was no longer any barrier to Constantine III's return from exile. A referendum brought Constantine back as king just weeks after Alexander's death. But Constantine's return alarmed the Allies, who had forced him out in the first place. Britain and France withdrew their support for Greece's military campaign in Turkey. The Turkish forces, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, counterattacked with devastating effectiveness. The Greek army, which had seemed on the verge of victory when Alexander died, suffered catastrophic defeats. The Greek invasion of Turkey ended in complete disaster. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed or captured. Over 1 million Greek civilians expelled from Turkey. A national humiliation that scarred Greece for generations. All of this flowed from a monkey bite. If Alexander's dog hadn't chased the monkey that day, if Alexander hadn't intervened, if the bite had been properly treated with modern antibiotics, history might have been completely different. The Greek invasion of Turkey might have succeeded. The population exchanges might never have happened. The entire balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean could have shifted. But Alexander did intervene. He did get bitten. The infection did kill him, and history unfolded as it did. His death stands as one of history's most dramatic examples of how small incidents can cascade into enormous consequences. Monkey's bite killed a king and changed the fate of nations. Moving from monkeys to even stranger circumstances, we encounter Sigurd Eysteinsson, a Viking earl who was killed by a severed head. Sigurd the Mighty, as he was known, ruled Orkney in the late 9th century. The Orkney Islands sit north of Scotland, a strategic location that gave Sigurd control over important sea routes. He was one of many Viking lords who ruled territories in and around Scotland during this era, men who had come from Scandinavia as raiders but established themselves as permanent rulers. Sigurd was ambitious. Orkney wasn't enough for him. He wanted to expand his territory into mainland Scotland. This brought him into conflict with Malbright, a Scottish noble who served as Earl of Moray. Malbright had a distinctive physical feature that earned him a memorable nickname. He was called Malbright the Buck-toothed because of his prominent protruding teeth. Neither Sigurd nor Malbrighte wanted full-scale war. Armies were expensive, casualties depleted their forces, and the outcome of battles was uncertain. So around 892, the two earls agreed to settle their territorial dispute through a smaller battle. Each would bring exactly 40 men. They would fight it out in one engagement, and the winner would claim the disputed territory. It was a reasonable plan, the sort of agreement that kept medieval conflicts from spiraling into endless wars. But Sigurd had no intention of honouring the agreement. When the day of battle came, he brought 40 horses as agreed, but mounted 80 men on those 40 horses, 2 warriors per horse. It was a cheap trick, a blatant violation of their agreement, but Sigurd reasoned that victory justified treachery. The battle was short and one-sided. Malbrigt's 40 men faced 80 opponents and were quickly overwhelmed. Malbright himself died in the fighting, along with all his warriors. Sigurd's forces won complete victory without suffering serious casualties. According to Viking custom, Sigurd ordered his men to behead the dead enemies. They would carry these heads back as trophies, proof of their victory. Malbright's distinctive buck-toothed head was the prize. Sigurd personally claimed it, tying it to his saddle by the hair so it would bounce alongside his leg as he rode home in triumph. The victorious warriors mounted their horses and began the journey back to Orkney, congratulating themselves on the successful battle. Sigurd rode at their head, the severed head of Malbright dangling from his saddle. The head swung and bounced with the horse's movement, knocking against Sigurd's leg with each step, and with each knock, Malbright's prominent buck teeth scraped against Sigurd's calf. The teeth that had given him his nickname in life became his instrument of revenge in death. The sharp edges of those protruding teeth abraded Sigurd's skin through his clothing. At first, it was probably just annoying, a minor discomfort that Sigurd ignored in his celebration. But the constant scraping eventually broke through the skin, creating a small wound. That wound became infected. In the 9th century, even minor injuries could turn deadly. Sigurd had no way of knowing that Malbright's dead mouth harboured dangerous bacteria, or that the wound on his leg was becoming septic. By the time he realized something was wrong, the infection had spread beyond treatment. Sigurd the Mighty died from the infected wound, killed as surely as if Malbright had stabbed him during the battle. The Orkneyinga saga, a 13th century Norse history text, preserves this story as a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of fate. Sigurd had won the battle through treachery, had killed his enemy and claimed his head as a trophy, had violated his agreement and gotten away with it, and still died because of that victory, killed by the very trophy he had claimed. Modern medical understanding makes the story even more plausible. Heads remain capable of harboring dangerous bacteria long after death. The mouth in particular contains numerous bacterial species, some of which can cause serious infections if introduced into wounds. Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, and anaerobic bacteria from the mouth can all cause infections that progress to blood poisoning. Sigurd's constant close contact with the severed head, combined with the repeated abrasion from the teeth, created perfect conditions for infection. The wound would have been contaminated repeatedly as the head bounced against his leg, even if he had noticed and tried to treat the scratch. 9th century medicine offered no effective solutions for bacterial infection. The story has a certain poetic justice that makes it memorable. Sigurd achieved victory through dishonorable means, violating an agreement and bringing double the forces he had promised. He succeeded in killing his enemy and claiming territory. But his victory was hollow. The man he killed got revenge from beyond the grave, using his most distinctive feature, those buck teeth, as the instrument of death. From Scotland, we travel south to England, and a death so bizarre, so seemingly impossible, that historians have debated its truth for centuries. William the Conqueror's exploding corpse. William became King of England in 1066 after defeating King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. This marked the Norman Conquest, one of the most significant events in English history. William ruled for 21 years, brutally suppressing rebellions and establishing Norman control over England. By 1087, William was about 60 years old. Ancient by medieval standards, he had grown enormously fat, so obese that he could barely move. His weight made riding horses difficult, and given that medieval warfare and rulership required constant travel on horseback, this created serious problems. Contemporary chroniclers described him as having a protruding belly and being so fat that French King Philip the supposedly joked about William looking pregnant. In July 1087, William was campaigning in France, besieging the town of Mantes. During the attack, his horse stumbled or reared, and William was thrown forward against the iron pommel of his saddle. Given his weight, the impact was severe. The pommel struck his abdomen with tremendous force, causing internal injuries. William initially tried to continue commanding his forces, but the pain proved too severe. He was transported to Rouen, where he took to bed in the priory of Saint-Gervais. For 6 weeks he lingered, suffering from what was probably a ruptured organ or severe internal bleeding. The specific nature of his injuries remains uncertain, but contemporary accounts describe excruciating abdominal pain. On September 9th, 1087, William the Conqueror died. With his death, chaos erupted among his family. His 3 sons, Robert, William, and Henry, immediately began quarrelling over their inheritances. Robert claimed Normandy, William claimed England, Henry was promised silver. The brothers argued bitterly, each trying to seize what they could before their father was even cold. In the confusion and squabbling, nobody took responsibility for the actual body. William's servants and attendants, seeing that the king was dead and fearing they wouldn't be paid, fled. They literally abandoned the corpse, stripping the room of anything valuable, William's clothes, his belongings, even the bed linens, and disappeared into the countryside. The naked body of the king lay alone in the priory for over a day before anyone took charge. Finally, local church officials stepped in. Appalled at this disrespectful treatment, they organized a funeral procession to take William's body to Caen for burial at the abbey he had founded there. But the journey from Rouen to Caen took several days, and it was September, still warm weather in northern France. The body, which had not been properly embalmed or preserved, began to decompose during the journey. By the time the funeral procession arrived at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, the smell was becoming noticeable. The clergy arranged for William's burial in a stone sarcophagus that had been prepared for him. They conducted the funeral mass with as much dignity as they could muster under the circumstances. Then came time to place the body in the sarcophagus. Here they discovered a problem. William was too big. The sarcophagus had been measured and constructed years earlier when William was thinner. His enormous weight gain in his final years meant he no longer fit in the space prepared for him. The bloating of decomposition made things even worse. The attendants tried to force the body into the sarcophagus. They pushed and shoved, attempting to compress the corpse enough to fit. And then, according to multiple chroniclers who recorded the event, the pressure caused William's abdomen to burst open. The smell that had been building inside the decomposing body suddenly exploded outward, along with whatever internal fluids and gases had accumulated. The stench was overwhelming, instantly filling the church. Contemporary accounts describe people gagging, vomiting, and fleeing from the building. The solemn funeral mass dissolved into chaos as clergy and mourners rushed for fresh air. Orderic Vitalis, a chronicler writing shortly after the events, recorded that the swollen bowels burst and an intolerable stench assailed the nostrils of the bystanders and the whole crowd. Another account states that the horrible smell was so bad that even the incense and spices they burned couldn't mask it. The funeral officials did their best to contain the disaster. They poured spices and perfumes over the body, trying to mask the smell. They hurried through the remainder of the service as quickly as possible. They managed to somehow stuff William's burst remains into the sarcophagus and seal it. Then they got out of the church as fast as dignity would allow. William the Conqueror, one of the most powerful kings in European history, the man who had conquered England and defeated King Harold, ended with his corpse exploding in front of a church full of nobility and clergy. His final moments on earth were marked not by prayers and tributes, but by vomit and the overpowering stench of rotting flesh. The story might be exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers loved dramatic details and sometimes embellished events, but the basic facts seem reliable. Multiple independent sources mention the terrible smell and the body bursting. The circumstances, delayed burial, warm weather, inadequate preservation, attempts to force a too large body into a too small space, make the event plausible from a medical and biological standpoint. Even worse, William's troubles didn't end with burial. His tomb was desecrated during the French Wars of Religion in the 16th century. A mob broke into the abbey, destroyed his tomb, and scattered his bones. Only a thigh bone was saved, and even that was later lost during the French Revolution. Today, a simple stone slab marks where William was originally buried, but no remains survive. Moving forward several centuries, we encounter a death that seems too stupid to be true. King Charles VIII of France, who died from hitting his head on a doorframe. Charles became King of France in 1483 at age 13. He grew up to be a mediocre king, who spent most of his reign pursuing an ill-advised invasion of Italy. He married Anne of Brittany and desperately wanted an heir to secure his dynasty. But Anne suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Of 7 children she bore, only 1 survived past infancy, and that child died at age 3. By 1498, Charles was 37 years old, childless, and worried about the succession. On April 7th, 1498, he and his queen were at the Château d'Amboise in the Loire Valley. The royal couple planned to watch a tennis match, Jeu de Paume, the medieval precursor to modern tennis. To reach the tennis courts, Charles and Anne walked through a gallery in the castle. This gallery had a low doorway with a stone lintel across the top. Charles, in his enthusiasm to watch the tennis match, walked quickly through the doorway. He struck his head on the stone lintel with tremendous force. The blow knocked him backward and probably dazed him severely. But Charles was young and healthy. He shook it off, laughed about his clumsiness, and continued to the tennis court with Anne. They watched the match for several hours. Then, around 2 in the afternoon, Charles suddenly collapsed. He fell to the ground unconscious, unable to speak or move. Servants carried him to a nearby room and laid him on a bed. Though accounts vary, some say they had to lay him on a straw pallet, because no proper bed was immediately available. Anne stayed by his side, praying for his recovery. Charles never regained consciousness. He died 9 hours later, at 11 that night, still lying where servants had placed him after his collapse. The cause of death was clear. The blow to his head had caused a traumatic brain injury, probably an epidural or subdural hematoma. Blood accumulated between his skull and brain, putting pressure on the brain tissue. The pressure built slowly over several hours, causing compression, herniation, and eventually death. Modern doctors recognize this pattern immediately. Someone suffers head trauma, seems fine initially, then deteriorates hours later and dies. It's called talk and die syndrome in emergency medicine. The initial impact tears blood vessels inside the skull. Blood leaks out slowly, pooling and creating pressure. The victim seems fine because the bleeding is slow and the brain has some capacity to tolerate increased pressure. But eventually, a threshold is reached where the brain can no longer compensate. Consciousness is lost, and without surgical intervention to relieve the pressure, death follows quickly. Charles V had no access to neurosurgery. The concept wouldn't exist for another 4 centuries. Even if doctors had understood what was happening, they could have done nothing. Charles was doomed from the moment he hit his head, even though he walked around for hours afterward feeling relatively fine. His death left France in crisis. He had no children, no direct heir. The crown passed to his distant cousin Louis XIV, beginning a new line of succession. Charles's widow Anne, still in her early 20s, was forced to marry Louis XIV to maintain stability. She married 2 kings in succession, both times for political necessity rather than choice. The stupidity of Charles VIII's death cannot be overstated. He was king of France, one of the most powerful men in Europe. He didn't die in battle, or from disease, or even from assassination. He died because he wasn't paying attention and smacked his head on a doorframe. It's the sort of death that might befall anyone during a moment of carelessness, but most people who bump their heads on doorways just get a bruise and feel foolish. Charles got a fatal brain injury. The doorway that killed him was apparently quite low. Contemporary accounts mention that it was low slung, or had an especially low lintel. Why Charles didn't duck or watch where he was going remains a mystery. Perhaps he was distracted by conversation with Anne. Perhaps he was thinking about the tennis match. Perhaps he simply misjudged the height. Whatever the reason, a moment of inattention cost him his life. Our final bizarre death brings us to Adolf Fredrik, King of Sweden, who literally ate himself to death in 1771. Adolf Fredrik became king in 1751 through a complicated election process. Sweden at this time had a constitutional monarchy where the Riksdag, the parliament, held most real power. The king was essentially a figurehead, which frustrated Adolf Fredrik immensely. He wanted to be a real monarch with actual authority, but Parliament kept him on a tight leash, unable to exercise power politically. Adolf Fredrik turned to other pleasures. He loved good food, and he loved it in massive quantities. Swedish royal banquets were legendary for their extravagance. Multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last, went on for hours. Nobles competed to serve the most impressive meals when hosting the king. Adolf Fredrik was not content with normal portions. He ate like a man possessed, consuming amounts of food that astonished even his contemporaries accustomed to large royal meals. His weight ballooned over the years. His health declined. Doctors warned him to moderate his eating, but the king ignored them. On February 12th, 1771, Adolf Frederick attended a particularly lavish dinner. The menu included lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, a Swedish herring dish, and champagne. Any one of these might have made a full meal for a normal person. The king consumed them all, along with numerous other dishes. Then came dessert. The chef had prepared semla, a traditional Swedish pastry. Semla are delicious, sweet buns filled with almond paste and topped with whipped cream. They're rich, dense, and filling. One or two would satisfy most people. The king ordered a serving, and then another, and another. He kept eating semla one after another, unable or unwilling to stop. Accounts vary on exactly how many he ate. Some sources say 14 servings. Others say the number was lower, but still excessive. What everyone agrees on is that Adolf Frederick ate himself into a dangerous state of distress. Shortly after the meal, the king began complaining of severe stomach pain. His abdomen was distended, swollen from the enormous quantity of food. He felt nauseous, but couldn't vomit. His stomach was too full, too stretched. The pain intensified, becoming unbearable. Doctors were summoned, but they could do nothing. The king's stomach and intestines had been pushed beyond their limits. The sheer volume of food had caused acute gastric dilation. His digestive system couldn't process everything he had consumed. The food sat in his stomach, fermenting, producing gases that couldn't escape. The pressure built, stretching his stomach wall dangerously thin. Adolf Frederick died that night, probably from a combination of factors: gastric rupture, aspiration if he finally did vomit, heart attack brought on by the stress on his system, or some other complication of his massive overconsumption. The official cause of death was listed as digestion problems, a polite euphemism for he ate himself to death. The Swedish public received the news with mixed emotions. Adolf Frederick had been a harmless but ineffectual king, beloved by some for his gentle nature, dismissed by others as weak and useless. But everyone agreed on one thing: his death was absurd. He had literally died from eating too much dessert. In the centuries since, semla has become known in Sweden as the dessert that killed a king. Bakeries advertise their semla with references to Adolf Frederick. The story has become part of Swedish folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of gluttony. Each year during the Lenten season, when semlor are traditionally eaten, Swedish media run stories about the king who couldn't resist one more pastry. These deaths, by toilet, by monkey, by severed head, by doorframe, by dessert, share a common theme. They remind us that death doesn't respect rank or dignity. A king can die as absurdly as anyone else. All the power, wealth, and privilege in the world can't protect you from a moment of bad luck, poor judgment, or simple biological limitation. They also reveal how little control we have over our ultimate fate. Edmund Ironside couldn't have known an assassin hid beneath his privy. George II couldn't have predicted his aneurysm would rupture at that particular moment. Alexander of Greece couldn't have foreseen that a monkey bite would kill him. Sigurd the Mighty couldn't have imagined that his trophy would become his killer. William the Conqueror couldn't have anticipated his corpse exploding at his funeral. Charles VIII couldn't have known that bumping his head would be fatal. Adolf Frederick didn't intend to eat himself to death. He just couldn't stop reaching for one more pastry. These royals met ridiculous deaths, but they faced those deaths with the same ultimate helplessness as any peasant or commoner. The crown offers no protection from fate's cruel jokes. Death comes for everyone, and sometimes it comes in the most absurd and undignified ways imaginable, reducing even mighty kings to punchlines in history's darkest comedy. Strange customs behind palace walls. Behind the glittering facade of British royalty lies a world of bizarre customs, peculiar traditions, and utterly strange habits that seem designed to remind everyone that royals are not quite like the rest of us. Some of these customs served practical purposes in their time. Others arose from superstition or simple royal whim, and some defy any rational explanation whatsoever. Let us explore the stranger side of royal life, where logic gives way to tradition and common sense bows before protocol. We begin with perhaps the most widely known yet still bizarre royal custom, the monarch's double birthday. Queen Elizabeth II celebrated 2 birthdays every year, and so will all future British monarchs. The official birthday usually falls on the second Saturday in June, marked by the Trooping the Colours ceremony, a massive military parade through London. The actual birthday, of course, occurs on the date the monarch was actually born. Elizabeth's real birthday was April 21st, but she celebrated publicly in June with all the pageantry the British can muster. Why this strange doubling? The answer is weather. King George II, born in October 1683, became king in 1727. He wanted a grand public birthday celebration with outdoor ceremonies, military parades, and crowds of celebrating subjects. But October weather in Britain is notoriously unpredictable. Cold, rainy, often miserable. A huge outdoor celebration risked being washed out or frozen out, disappointing everyone and making the monarchy look foolish. So in 1748, George II simply declared that his official birthday would be celebrated in June, during the annual summer military parade. June weather in London, while still not guaranteed to be perfect, is at least warmer and generally drier than October or November. The tradition stuck. Every British monarch since has maintained this custom of having both a real birthday celebrated privately with family and an official birthday celebrated publicly with grand ceremonies. The absurdity of having 2 birthdays seems lost on most Britons, who accept it as normal. The monarch gets birthday wishes, birthday celebrations, and birthday honours twice a year. It's the ultimate expression of royal privilege. Not only are you born to rule, but you get to be born twice. Moving from birthdays to bedrooms, we encounter another peculiar tradition, the royal bath ritual. Queen Elizabeth II had very specific requirements for her morning bath, requirements that her staff had to meet exactly every single day for decades. Her Majesty woke each morning at 7:30 to find a cup of tea waiting at her bedside. While she enjoyed this tea, her personal maid went into the adjoining bathroom to prepare the bath. This wasn't as simple as turning on taps and waiting. The bath had to be exactly the right depth, no more and no less than 7 inches of water. Not 6 inches, not 8 inches, but 7 inches precisely. The temperature also had to be exact. The maid tested the water temperature using a wooden case thermometer, measuring to ensure the bath was neither too hot nor too cold. Once the temperature and depth were both perfect, the Queen could proceed to bathe. This ritual occurred daily, without variation, for the entirety of Elizabeth II's reign. Why 7 inches? Why not 6 or 8? Why such precision? No one outside the royal household knows. Perhaps Elizabeth simply preferred this particular water depth and made it a rule. Perhaps 7 inches was traditional, passed down from previous monarchs. Perhaps there's some practical reason related to the specific bathtub in Buckingham Palace. Whatever the origin, it became absolute law within the royal household. 7 inches, tested with a thermometer, every morning without fail. After bathing, the Queen underwent another carefully orchestrated ritual, getting dressed. Her personal dresser, Angela Kelly, assisted with this process, which could take considerable time depending on what the day's schedule required. For formal events, dressing might take an hour or more, with layers of undergarments, the dress or suit itself, jewellery, hats, gloves, and numerous other components all coordinated precisely. The Queen's wardrobe contained thousands of items, each catalogued and organised. Kelly maintained detailed records of what the Queen wore to which events, ensuring Elizabeth never appeared in the same outfit at similar occasions. The Queen's clothes were designed with specific practical considerations. Hems weighted to prevent wind from blowing up her skirts, colours chosen to be visible in crowds, fabrics selected to not wrinkle during long periods of sitting or standing. But the strangest aspect of royal dressing relates to shoes. New shoes cannot simply be purchased and worn. They must be broken in first, softened and shaped to the foot. But the Queen couldn't be expected to suffer through the painful process of breaking in new shoes herself. She had far too many important duties. The solution? Staff members, with the same shoe size as the Queen, wore new shoes first, walking around the palace until the shoes were sufficiently comfortable. Only then would the shoes be presented to Her Majesty. This tradition of having servants break in your shoes seems like the ultimate expression of royal privilege. Not only do you not have to work for a living, but you don't even have to endure slightly uncomfortable footwear. Someone else will handle that inconvenience for you. From shoes to shoelaces, we discover an even more bizarre grooming custom. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, maintained personal valets whose duties included an extraordinary level of fussiness about his appearance. These valets didn't just clean his clothes and help him dress, they ironed his shoelaces. Yes, his shoelaces. Those strings you thread through holes in shoes and tie in bows. Strings that most people never give a second thought to their appearance. Strings that will inevitably become rumpled and creased through normal use. Charles insisted his shoelaces be ironed flat and smooth. His valets would carefully remove the laces from his shoes, iron them until they were perfectly flat and unwrinkled, then thread them back into the shoes before the prince wore them. The logic of this escapes most observers. Shoelaces that touch the ground will immediately become dirty and creased. The act of tying them creates wrinkles and folds. Within minutes of putting on the shoes, those perfectly ironed laces will be indistinguishable from unironed ones. But apparently, the knowledge that his laces were professionally ironed mattered to Charles, regardless of how long that pristine state would last. This obsessive attention to minute details of appearance extends throughout royal life. Prince Charles reportedly travels with his own toilet seat, which staff must install wherever he stays. His pajamas are ironed. His toothpaste must be applied to his toothbrush for him, squeezed to precisely the right amount. These aren't necessities. They're absurd luxuries that exist simply because they can. Because when you're royal, no detail is too small to delegate to others. Speaking of peculiar morning rituals, the monarch traditionally awakens to music, specifically to bagpipe music played directly outside the bedroom window. Queen Elizabeth II enjoyed this tradition for decades. Every morning from 7 to 9 a.m., when she was in residence at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Holyrood House, or Balmoral, a bagpiper would march beneath her window playing for 15 minutes. This position, piper to the sovereign, is an official role, one of the many peculiar jobs that exist only to serve the royal household. The piper wears full Scottish Highland dress and plays a selection of tunes to begin the Queen's day. It's simultaneously charming and utterly bizarre. Imagine being woken every morning by bagpipes outside your window. Most people would find this maddening, but for the Queen, it was a beloved tradition, something she looked forward to and apparently enjoyed. The custom dates back to Queen Victoria, who established the position in 1843 after visiting Scotland and developing an affection for Scottish culture. Every monarch since has maintained the tradition, suggesting they all share Victoria's tolerance, even enthusiasm, for being serenaded by bagpipes at dawn. Moving from music to meals, royal dining involves numerous strange customs. The monarch controls the pace of every meal. When the Queen finished each course, everyone else's plates were removed, whether they had finished eating or not. This created tremendous pressure for guests to eat quickly, always keeping pace with Her Majesty. A slow eater might find themselves hungry, having barely touched their food before servants whisked it away because the Queen had finished. The royal dinner table follows strict precedence rules about who sits where. The most important guests sit closest to the monarch, with importance decreasing as one moves away. This ranking system determines not just seating, but also which courses you're served first, how much attention you receive from the monarch, and ultimately your status in the social hierarchy. Conversations at royal dinners follow peculiar rules. The monarch traditionally speaks to the person on their right during the first course, then switches to the person on the left for subsequent courses. Other diners are expected to follow this pattern, turning to speak to different neighbours as courses progress. This ensures everyone has the opportunity to converse with those around them, but it also creates artificial conversational boundaries that can seem awkward and forced. Royal meals historically featured absurd quantities of food. Medieval and Tudor banquets might include dozens of courses, whole roasted animals, elaborate pastries, exotic fruits, massive quantities of wine and ale. Even in more modern times, state dinners featured far more food than anyone could reasonably eat. The excess served multiple purposes, displaying wealth and power, ensuring every guest could find something appealing, and simply maintaining tradition. But the strangest dining tradition involves Christmas dinner at Sandringham, the royal estate in Norfolk. Before the meal, all guests are weighed on scales in the hallway. After the meal, they're weighed again. The goal is to prove they've gained weight during the feast, evidence that they've eaten well and enjoyed the hospitality. This tradition supposedly dates back to King Edward VII, who wanted to ensure his guests ate enough. Imagine arriving at someone's house for Christmas dinner and being weighed before you can enter. Then, after eating, being weighed again with everyone comparing how much weight they've gained. It sounds like a nightmare for anyone with body image issues or eating disorders. But in the royal family, it's considered good fun, a charming tradition that shows you've appreciated the meal. The guest who gains the most weight wins the unspoken competition, proving they enjoyed the feast more than anyone else. Continuing our tour of strange customs, we arrive at transportation. The royal family travels with extraordinary amounts of luggage, but not for the reasons you might think. They don't simply pack many outfits, though they certainly do that. They also have specific color-coded luggage tags that identify who owns each piece. The Queen's luggage carries yellow tags, Prince Charles uses red tags, Princess Anne gets green. Every member of the royal family has an assigned color, making it instantly clear whose bags are whose. This system prevents mix-ups during the chaos of royal travel, when dozens or even hundreds of pieces of luggage might be loaded and unloaded from various vehicles and aircraft. But the color coding extends beyond mere identification. It also signals priority. Yellow-tagged bags, the Queen's, must be handled first and with utmost care. Red bags come next, green bags third, and so on down the hierarchy. Even luggage follows royal precedence, with the monarch's suitcases enjoying privileges over everyone else's. The royal family also travels with bizarre quantities of specialized items. The Queen famously traveled with her own blood supply, several pints of her blood type stored in secure containers, available in case of medical emergency in countries where the blood supply might be questionable. She traveled with a Royal Navy doctor, comprehensive medical supplies, and detailed plans for handling any health crisis that might arise. Household items travel too. Favorite pillows, specific brands of tea and jam, even toilet paper. The royals don't trust foreign hotels and palaces to provide everything they need, so they bring it themselves. This paranoia about using local supplies creates enormous logistical challenges. The staff must pack, transport, set up, then repack and transport home again. All these items for every single royal trip. Perhaps the strangest travel tradition involves royal protocol when entering rooms. Servants must never turn their backs on the monarch. This creates complicated choreography when, say, opening doors. A servant must open the door, then back through it themselves while facing the monarch, then somehow close it behind the royal without ever turning away. This backward door opening requires practice to execute smoothly. Similarly, servants must never sit in the presence of standing royalty. If the queen stands up, everyone else must stand. If she sits, others may sit, but only after she's settled. This creates scenarios where servants must pop up and down repeatedly as the royal moves about, like a peculiar game of Jack-in-the-Box conducted with absolute seriousness. Moving from protocols to superstitions, we discover that the royal family maintains various traditional beliefs that border on magical thinking. The ravens at the Tower of London provide the most famous example. Legend holds that if the ravens ever leave the tower, the crown will fall and Britain will be destroyed. King Charles II supposedly established the tradition of keeping ravens at the tower after being told of this prophecy. Whether Charles II actually believed the prophecy or simply enjoyed having ravens around remains unclear, but the tradition stuck. To this day, the Tower of London keeps at least 6 ravens, cared for by a raven master. Yes, that's an actual job title. The ravens have their wings clipped to prevent them from flying away and dooming Britain. They're fed a special diet of raw meat and biscuits soaked in blood. They're given names, currently including Jubilee, Harris, Grip, Georgie, Edgar, and Branwen. The ravens enjoy special privileges. They can wander freely through the tower grounds. Tourists must not touch or disturb them. The raven master monitors their health obsessively, because if ravens start dying or leaving in numbers, people will genuinely worry about the prophecy. Never mind that Britain has survived far greater threats than bird departures. The superstition maintains its grip on the imagination. Other royal superstitions include beliefs about opals being unlucky, unless they're your birthstone, peacock feathers bringing bad luck inside houses, and various omens connected to wildlife behavior. Queen Victoria maintained elaborate superstitions about death and mourning, wearing black for 40 years after Prince Albert died, and establishing protocols for grieving that seemed designed to maximize misery. Perhaps the strangest superstition involves the royal ban on playing Monopoly. Yes, the board game Monopoly is reportedly forbidden in the royal family. Prince Andrew revealed this ban in 2008, explaining that Monopoly games in the royal household became too vicious, too competitive, too likely to cause genuine anger and fighting. Rather than adults learning to control themselves during a board game, the family simply banned the game entirely. Imagine being so competitive, so unable to lose gracefully, that your family has to ban a board game. It's simultaneously humanizing. They're competitive and get frustrated just like normal families, and absurd. Most families deal with Monopoly-induced arguments by agreeing to put the game away for a while or modifying the rules. The royals apparently found it easier to issue a blanket ban. From games to names, we discover that royals face restrictions most people never consider. The monarch must approve any marriage of the monarch's descendants for several generations. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed during George III's reign, gave the sovereign power to veto any marriage among lineal descendants of George II. This law existed to prevent unsuitable marriages that might embarrass the crown or complicate succession. The law led to numerous conflicts over the centuries, prince became Prince George, Duke of Kent, had to give up his proposed marriage to a Catholic woman in the 1930s because the king would not grant permission. Princess Margaret couldn't marry Peter Townsend in the 1950s because he was divorced, and the Church and Crown both opposed divorce at the time. The Succession to the Crown Act of 2013 modified these rules, requiring permission only for the first 6 people in line to the throne. But the underlying principle remains. Royals cannot simply marry whomever they choose. The monarch's approval is required, making royal romances a matter of state policy rather than personal choice. Names face similar restrictions and traditions. Royal children typically receive multiple given names. Prince William's full name is William Arthur Philip Louis, for instance. These names honor previous monarchs, relatives, and important figures, but they cannot be used freely. If William wanted to be called Arthur instead of William, protocol would prevent it. The first name is the official name, the one used in all formal contexts and by which history will remember them. When royals ascend to the throne, they may choose to reign under a different name than their given name. King George VI was actually named Albert Frederick Arthur George and was called Bertie by family, but there had recently been 3 King George, making it seem appropriate to continue that tradition rather than becoming King Albert. So upon his unexpected ascension, when his brother abdicated, Bertie became George VI. This freedom to choose one's regnal name creates strange possibilities. The current Prince William could theoretically choose to reign as King Arthur if he wanted, though that seems unlikely. The tradition exists partly to avoid unfortunate name associations. No one wants to be compared to bad or weak previous monarchs with the same name, and partly to allow continuity or fresh starts as circumstances require. Royal children's births involve peculiar traditions that have mostly died out, but linger in memory. Historically, members of the government had to be present at royal births to verify the baby was actually born to the Queen and not switched with some imposter. This tradition supposedly prevented anyone from sneaking in a different baby to secure succession. Imagine being in labour and having government ministers standing around watching. The privacy violation seems appalling by modern standards, but for centuries, this was standard practice, designed to prevent succession fraud. The tradition only ended in the 20th century, much to the relief of royal mothers everywhere. Even after birth, royal babies face unusual circumstances. They're immediately attended by royal physicians, registered by special procedures, and introduced to public life with carefully choreographed announcements. The famous step of new royal parents presenting their baby on the hospital steps, allowing photographers to capture the first public images, creates enormous pressure on mothers who have just given birth. They're expected to appear polished, composed, happy. No hint of the exhaustion, pain, or hormonal chaos that normally follows childbirth. Royal childhood involves its own strange customs. Young royals must learn to walk behind their parents in public, never ahead. They must learn the royal wave, a specific motion of the hand that differs from normal waving. They must learn proper posture, how to enter and exit vehicles gracefully, how to shake hands appropriately with various types of people. These skills, which seem trivial, require actual training and practice. They also must learn to tolerate discomfort without complaint. Royal events often involve long periods of standing, sitting perfectly still, or wearing uncomfortable formal clothing. Young royals must master the art of appearing comfortable and happy even when bored, tired, or physically uncomfortable. Squirming, fidgeting, or showing distress is not allowed. The royal mask of pleasant composure must remain firmly in place. From childhood to death, royal life operates according to rules and customs that often defy logic. When a monarch dies, elaborate protocols swing into action with almost military precision. Every aspect is planned years in advance, with detailed documents specifying who does what, when, and how. These plans have code names. Queen Elizabeth II's funeral plan was called Operation London Bridge. Plans exist for every senior royal's death, each with its own operational name. Staff rehearse these plans periodically, ensuring everything will proceed smoothly when the time comes. It's simultaneously practical. Major state events require careful planning, and macabre, practicing for someone's death while they're still alive. The strangest death custom involves the announcement. When the monarch dies, specific people must be informed in specific order. The Prime Minister learns first, then other government officials, then the Commonwealth realms, then the general public. This notification follows strict protocol, with each step carefully timed and coordinated. The public announcement traditionally involves a notice posted on the gates of Buckingham Palace, stating the time and place of death in formal language. This notice must be precisely worded, mounted properly, and displayed correctly. Even in our modern age of instant communication, this physical posting of death notices continues, maintaining a tradition centuries old. Following a monarch's death, Britain enters an official period of mourning that affects everything from government business to entertainment. TV and radio stations alter their programming, showing respectful content and avoiding anything too cheerful. Government offices display black-bordered notices. Flags fly at half-mast. The entire nation performs grief according to prescribed rituals, regardless of how people actually feel about the deceased monarch. These customs, from double birthdays to iron shoelaces, from weighed dinner guests to banned board games, from raven superstitions to choreographed deaths, reveal a family living according to rules that often seem arbitrary or absurd. Yet these traditions persist, maintained year after year, generation after generation, because that's what royalty does. They preserve customs that make no sense to outsiders, but that define what it means to be royal. The British royal family exists in a bubble of peculiar protocols and bizarre habits, protected from normal life by walls of tradition. They can't simply grab breakfast and head out the door. There are servants to coordinate, protocols to follow, appearances to maintain. They can't throw a casual dinner party. There are seating charts to arrange, precedents to respect, courses to coordinate. They can't even play Monopoly without risking a diplomatic incident. In maintaining these strange customs, the royals become living museums of historical oddity. They preserve ways of living that died out everywhere else, keeping alive traditions from centuries past, simply because tradition demands it. It makes them fascinating to observe, peculiar to contemplate, and occasionally absurd to anyone not raised in that rarefied world, where shoelaces must be ironed and toilet seats travel with their owners. Beyond the grand stories of madness, death, and strange customs lie countless smaller peculiarities that make the British royal family endlessly fascinating. These are the odds and ends of royal life, the curious facts that don't fit neatly into larger narratives, but that illuminate just how unusual life in a palace truly is. Let us begin with an oddity that seems almost too strange to believe. The monarch requires no passport to travel, while every other British citizen must carry a passport when travelling internationally. The Queen does not. The reasoning is beautifully circular. British passports are issued in the monarch's name, containing a message from the sovereign, requesting safe passage for the bearer. The Queen can hardly request safe passage from herself. Therefore, she needs no passport. This same logic extends to driver's licenses. The monarch can drive without a license because driving licenses, like passports, are issued in the sovereign's name. Queen Elizabeth II learned to drive during World War II when she served in the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, working as a mechanic and driver. She never took a driving test, never obtained a license, and legally didn't need either one. She could simply get behind the wheel and drive, protected by the quirk that made her the source of driving authority itself. This actually created some amusing situations. The Queen occasionally drove around her estates at what witnesses described as frightening speeds. She once famously took Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia for a drive around Balmoral, driving fast enough to unnerve him thoroughly. The prince came from a country where women weren't allowed to drive at all, and here was the Queen of England racing around country roads at high speed without an apparent care in the world. The no license rule extended beyond the Queen herself in limited ways. Until recently, other senior royals could apply for special licenses that exempted them from testing requirements. This meant members of the royal family could be legally driving on public roads without ever having demonstrated their competence behind the wheel. Thankfully, this particular privilege has been curtailed, and most royals now must pass regular driving tests like everyone else. Moving from driving to flying, the royal family maintains unusual restrictions on air travel. 2 heirs cannot fly together on the same aircraft. This rule exists to protect the succession. If a plane crash killed multiple heirs simultaneously, it could create a succession crisis. So Prince William and Prince George, being first and second in line respectively, must travel on separate aircraft. This rule leads to complicated logistics. When the royal family takes trips together, they must coordinate multiple flights. Children must be split up, with heirs flying separately, even if they're traveling to the same destination. As George and his siblings grow older, family vacations will require multiple planes just to ensure the succession remains secure if disaster strikes. The rule apparently caused some tension when William wanted to fly with his family together. He had to request special permission from the Queen to override the protocol for convenience. The request sparked debate about whether protecting succession outweighed family togetherness. Ultimately, the Queen granted limited exceptions, but the underlying rule remains: heirs should not travel together on the same flight if it can be avoided. Another travel peculiarity involves haemophilia and royal blood supplies. The Queen travelled with her own blood in secure containers, as mentioned earlier. But this practice has historical roots in one of the royal family's darkest secrets, the spread of haemophilia through European royal families. Queen Victoria carried the gene for haemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. She passed this gene to several of her children, who then married into other European royal families and spread the disorder across the continent. Russia's Tsarevich Alexei suffered from haemophilia, inherited through this line, which contributed to the rise of Rasputin, and ultimately to events leading to the Russian Revolution. The presence of haemophilia in multiple royal houses created medical emergencies and succession concerns throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Royal families became paranoid about their blood, about medical care, about ensuring their heirs survived. This legacy influenced how modern royals approach medical planning during travel, leading to the practice of bringing blood supplies and comprehensive medical teams on foreign trips. Continuing with medical matters, the royal family employs numerous specialized physicians and medical staff. They have doctors specifically for different specialties: a royal obstetrician, a royal surgeon, a royal physician who handles general health. These positions carry enormous prestige. To be appointed a royal physician is the pinnacle of medical achievement in Britain. But these positions also carry unusual requirements. Royal doctors must be available at all hours, must travel with the family when required, must maintain absolute confidentiality about royal health matters. They essentially become part of the royal household, their lives revolving around the medical needs of their royal patients. The royal physicians have historically kept such tight confidentiality that historians often struggle to determine what ailments various monarchs suffered. Medical records are sealed, symptoms kept secret, conditions hidden from public view. This secrecy serves to maintain the royal image of strength and health, but it also prevents accurate historical understanding of how health affected various reigns and royal decisions. One particularly peculiar royal tradition involves royal godparents. When royal babies are christened, they receive godparents chosen according to complex social and political calculations. These aren't just honorary titles. Godparents historically had real responsibilities for the child's spiritual development and sometimes their physical well-being if parents died. But royal godparents face unusual challenges. They must maintain appropriate relationships with their royal godchildren throughout life, attending important events, giving appropriate gifts, showing proper deference while also providing guidance. For high-status godparents like foreign royalty or important political figures, this creates diplomatic complications. What do you give a prince who has everything for their birthday? How do you maintain an appropriate godparent relationship with someone you can only see a few times a year due to security and scheduling? Royal christenings themselves follow elaborate customs. The baby wears a specific christening gown, a replica of one made for Queen Victoria's eldest daughter in 1841. The ceremony takes place in a specific chapel using water from the River Jordan. Specific prayers are said, specific people must attend, and specific photographs must be taken. Even something as personal as a child's baptism becomes a state occasion requiring military-level planning. From christenings to Christmas, royal holiday celebrations follow peculiar traditions that would seem bizarre to most families. The royal family exchanges gifts on Christmas Eve, rather than Christmas morning, following German tradition brought by Prince Albert in the 19th century. They exchange joke gifts and gag gifts rather than expensive presents, apparently trying to make each other laugh with creative silliness rather than impressing with lavish spending. But the gifts must be carefully chosen. You can't simply grab any random gag gift. It must be appropriate, must not offend, must hit the right note of humor without crossing lines. The pressure to be cleverly funny while remaining respectful turns gift-giving into a stressful performance rather than spontaneous fun. Christmas dinner, as mentioned earlier, involves weighing guests, but it also features specific foods prepared specific ways. The royal Christmas pudding must be made following a traditional recipe. The turkey must be cooked precisely. Even the vegetables have specifications. The meal becomes a performance of tradition, with innovation or deviation strictly forbidden. After dinner, the family watches the Queen's Christmas broadcast, all together in respectful silence, even though they've probably seen it already during taping. They then play games, though as we've learned, Monopoly is banned. Other board games and card games are allowed, provided they remain friendly and don't lead to the sort of competitive fury that apparently erupted during Monopoly sessions. Moving from holidays to everyday life, we discover strange rules about royal fashion. The Queen never wore the same outfit twice to major public events. With thousands of engagements over her 70-year reign, this meant she required thousands of distinct outfits. Her personal dresser maintained detailed records tracking what she wore where, ensuring no repeat appearances. But the reasoning goes beyond simple vanity. The Queen appeared at events to be seen. That was the point. If she wore the same bright blue suit to multiple events, photographs would blend together. People couldn't remember which event was which. By wearing unique outfits, each appearance became distinct and memorable. The clothing served as visual markers in the historical record. This necessity created tremendous work for her dresser and the designers who created royal wardrobes. They had to produce enormous quantities of clothing, all meeting specific requirements, visible colors, modest lengths, comfortable fabrics, appropriate formality levels. They had to coordinate hats, shoes, purses, gloves, and jewelry with each outfit. The logistics of maintaining a queen's wardrobe rivaled running a small fashion house. Other royals faced different fashion restrictions. They cannot remove their jackets in public, even in hot weather. They cannot expose too much skin. Hemlines must be modest, necklines appropriate. They cannot wear casual clothes to official events. Even their choice of designers becomes politically fraught. Wearing a specific designer might be seen as endorsing them, while snubbing British designers for foreign ones could cause offence. Royal men face specific dress codes too. They must wear suits to most events, military uniforms to others. The type of tie, the colour of suit, the style of shoes, all follow unwritten rules that everyone at court understands, but that seem impossibly complex to outsiders. Prince Harry reportedly chafed under these restrictions, preferring casual comfort to formal propriety. Women in the royal family face additional peculiarities. They must wear hats to daytime events, but tiaras to evening events. They must carry purses even when they have no need for them. The purse serves as both fashion accessory and useful prop. The Queen famously used her purse to signal her staff. Certain positions or movements of the purse communicated specific messages about when she wanted to leave an event or needed rescue from a conversation. Royal women must also master the art of skirt management. With photographers constantly around, they must ensure they never expose too much leg when entering or exiting cars, sitting down, or dealing with wind. Some wear weighted hems to prevent skirts from blowing up. Others employ specific techniques for sitting and standing that minimize exposure risk. What should be simple movements become choreographed performances designed to maintain modesty under constant scrutiny. Continuing with appearance, we discover that royal women cannot wear dark nail polish to official events. The Queen preferred natural or nude shades, and this preference became unofficial policy for other royal women. Bright colours, dark colours, or trendy nail art are forbidden. This seems like a tiny thing, but it represents the level of control over personal appearance that royals must accept. Similarly, royal women must wear natural-looking makeup to official events. Heavy makeup, dramatic eyeshadow, bold lipstick colours, all forbidden or strongly discouraged. The goal is to look polished but natural, put together but not trying too hard. This requires skill to achieve. Looking effortless actually requires enormous effort. From appearance to speech, royals must follow specific communication rules. They cannot express political opinions publicly. They cannot endorse products or services. They cannot discuss controversial topics in interviews or speeches. Everything they say publicly must be carefully neutral, designed to unite rather than divide. This restriction essentially requires royals to have no publicly expressed opinions on most interesting topics: climate change, economic policy, social justice, foreign affairs, all off limits for direct comment. They can speak in vague generalities about the importance of unity, service, and tradition, but specific policy positions are forbidden. The speech restriction extends to personal matters too. Royals cannot discuss their marriages, their children's behaviour, their family conflicts in detail. The never complain, never explain principle means they must endure public criticism and speculation without defending themselves or telling their side of stories. This created particular problems for Princess Diana, who felt silenced and controlled by palace communications rules. Her decision to participate in candid interviews broke these rules spectacularly, leading to enormous conflict with the palace. More recently, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle face similar tensions between wanting to tell their truth and the palace's preference for silence and privacy. Royal communications extend to unusual terminology. The royal family doesn't use the same vocabulary as ordinary people. They don't say toilet or bathroom. They say lavatory or loo. They don't say lounge. They say sitting room. They don't say couch. They say sofa. These class-based linguistic differences serve as markers of status, unconscious signals about background and upbringing. Similarly, royals follow specific pronunciation rules. Certain words must be pronounced certain ways. The proper upper-class British accent, with its specific vowel sounds and rhythms, regional accents, contemporary slang, or American pronunciations are forbidden. The way you speak becomes part of performing royalty, distinguishing the palace from the people. From speech to reading, we discover that the royal family maintains different relationships with media than ordinary families. They receive all major newspapers daily, carefully curated to exclude the worst tabloid coverage while providing necessary information. Staff prepare summaries of relevant news stories, highlight items requiring royal attention, and generally filter the information flow. The Queen watched television, but selectively. She avoided most reality TV, dramatic series, or contemporary shows in favour of nature documentaries, historical programmes, and news broadcasts. Her viewing habits reflected her generation and status. She consumed media that educated or informed rather than merely entertained. Royal family members cannot simply binge-watch Netflix series or scroll endlessly through social media like ordinary people. Their media consumption must be appropriate, dignified, and above all, careful. Any show they watch or book they read might be scrutinized if publicly mentioned, analyzed for what it reveals about their opinions or interests. The royal family's relationship with technology remains complicated. The Queen famously learned to use email in her later years, but preferred handwritten correspondence. Other royals embrace technology more enthusiastically, but must still be careful. They cannot have personal social media accounts without palace management. They cannot post casual photos or thoughts without approval. Even their technology use follows protocols and restrictions. Royal phones are secured and monitored for security purposes. Their computers use special protections. Their internet usage is tracked. This isn't Big Brother surveillance, but necessary security. Royals are targets for hacking, identity theft, and cyber attacks. The restriction on normal technology use is protective, but also limiting. From technology to dining, we discover more oddities. Royals cannot eat certain foods in public. Shellfish is avoided due to food poisoning risk. Garlic is avoided because of the odor. Messy foods are avoided because eating them elegantly is difficult. This means royal menus at official events feature safe, boring choices: chicken, beef, simple vegetables, nothing that might cause embarrassment. The restriction extends beyond official events too. Even at private meals, certain foods are discouraged or forbidden. The reasoning varies. Some foods might cause allergies. Some might cause digestive issues. Some are simply not considered appropriate for royal consumption. Tea must be specific brands prepared specific ways. Coffee follows similar rules. Royal dining etiquette involves numerous small details that most people never consider. The speed of eating must match the monarch. If she finishes, everyone finishes, as mentioned earlier. But there are other rules too. You must hold cutlery specific ways. You must break bread with your hands, never cut it with a knife. You must place your napkin specific ways. You must leave specific amounts of food on your plate. These micro rules of etiquette serve to distinguish those who belong in royal circles from those who don't. Someone who doesn't know these rules immediately reveals themselves as an outsider, no matter how wealthy or educated. The etiquette becomes a gatekeeping mechanism, preserving the exclusivity of royal society. Moving to sleep, we discover that royal bedrooms follow their own peculiarities. The sheets must be changed daily, ironed smooth, placed just so. The pillows must be specific types, arranged specifically. The temperature must be controlled precisely. Royal beds become stages for elaborate preparation rituals performed by staff while the royals are elsewhere. The Queen slept alone. Even when married, Philip had his own bedroom. This wasn't unusual among British upper classes, where separate bedrooms allowed each person to maintain their sleep schedule without disturbing the other. But it seems strange to contemporary sensibilities, where sharing a bed is seen as intimacy and separate rooms suggest marital problems. Royal children historically slept in nurseries, cared for by nannies rather than parents. Parents visited the nursery at specific times, perhaps for an hour in the morning and another hour before bed. But the children lived separately from their parents' daily lives. This created distance between parents and children, formal relationships, where spontaneous affection was discouraged. This nanny-based child rearing produced adults who often struggled with emotional expression and intimacy. Prince Charles has spoken about his difficult childhood, the lack of warmth from his parents, the formal relationships that left him feeling unloved despite growing up in palaces. The system that provided physical luxury created emotional poverty. More recent royals have rejected some of these traditions. Prince William and Princess Catherine raised their children with more hands-on parenting, more physical affection, more emotional warmth. They still employed nannies for practical help, but didn't delegate parenting entirely. This represents a significant shift in royal child rearing, one that may produce healthier, more emotionally balanced royals in future generations. From childhood to old age, royal life involves countless small peculiarities that add up to an existence unlike anything most people experience. They live in palaces but cannot relax in them. The palaces are stages for public performance. They have enormous wealth but cannot spend it freely. Expenditures are scrutinized and criticized. They have prestigious positions but minimal freedom. Duty dictates their schedules and actions. They cannot leave the country without government approval. They cannot quit. Being royal is a lifetime appointment. They cannot choose careers outside a narrow range of acceptable options. They cannot marry without permission. They cannot speak freely, act spontaneously, or live authentic lives in public. Yet millions envy them, assuming royal life must be wonderful. The palaces and jewelry blind people to the cage those things represent. The royal family exists to serve the nation, to provide continuity and tradition, to perform monarchy. The bizarre customs and restrictions aren't quirky additions to comfortable lives. They're the price paid for privilege, the burden that comes with the crown. Understanding these peculiarities helps us see royals as humans trapped in gilded cages of tradition and protocol. They're simultaneously the most privileged and most constrained people in Britain, enjoying luxuries ordinary people can only dream of, while enduring restrictions ordinary people would find intolerable. The strangeness of royal life, from iron shoelaces to banned board games, from double birthdays to weighed dinner guests, reveals a family living according to rules that stopped making sense decades or centuries ago, but that continue because that's what tradition demands. As you drift towards sleep, let these strange tales from British royal history remind you that power and privilege offer no protection from the absurdities of life. Kings have died on toilets and been killed by severed heads. Queens have rotted their teeth with sugar and been slandered with lies about extra fingers. Princes have been bitten by monkeys and drowned in wine barrels. Throughout it all, the peculiar customs of palace life have continued. The iron shoelaces, the weighed dinner guests, the double birthdays, the raven superstitions. These stories show us that beneath the crowns and jewels, royals were and are simply human, flawed, fallible, sometimes foolish, occasionally tragic, and frequently strange. They faced death with as little dignity as anyone else. They suffered from their own poor choices and from circumstances beyond their control. They created bizarre traditions and maintained them for centuries. And through it all, they remind us that history's most powerful people were never quite as powerful as they seemed. Sleep well, knowing that even kings and queens couldn't escape life's fundamental absurdity. And if you enjoyed these tales, please leave a comment, even just a single word to let me know you were here. Like this video to help others find these soothing historical stories, and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more gentle journeys through history's strangest corners. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be less bizarre than British royal history, and may your morning bring you no exploding corpses, no monkey bites, and no need to iron your shoelaces.